You are the only person who could help me because you and I are equally in peril. But, Mr. Garfield, I see no reason why I should be upon the brink of this mysterious abyss, she cried. You don't explain the situation sufficiently fully? Because at present I cannot do so. No one regrets it more than myself. There is a grim mystery, a very great mystery, and I intend, with your assistance, to escape my enemy and clear it up. Who is your enemy? Oswald de Gex. He is my enemy as well as yours, I said very seriously. If you were in the possession of such facts as those I have gathered during the past week or so, you would be startled and well, perhaps terrified. But I only again beg of you to have a care of yourself. You have promised silence, and on my part, will carry on my search for the truth. The truth of what? The truth concerning Gabrielle Ingledew. The pretty little woman again looked at me very straight in the face for some moments without speaking. Then, with a strange hardness about her mouth, she said, Mr. Garfield, take it from me, you will never discover what you are in search of. The truth is too well hidden. What? Then you know something yet? I cried quickly. Yes. It is TME, she answered in a low, hard voice. I do know something of a certain secret that can never pass my lips. Chapter the 10th. Monsieur Souza again. Mrs. Cullerton's words held me breathless. At first I believed that I might wring the TNLTH from her lips, but I quickly saw that she intended to preserve her secret at all costs. Whether she actually believed what I had told her concerning her own peril was doubtful. In any case, she seemed in some strange manner held powerless and fascinated by the rich man who had saved her speculating husband from ruin. I remained there for still another quarter of an hour until her maid announced a visitor, when I was compelled to rise and take my leave. For a few days longer I remained in Florence, then I left for London. On entering the Calais Express at the Gare du Nord in Paris on my way home, I was agreeably surprised to find among my fellow travelers to England the affable French banker whom I had met on that memorable journey from York to London. He recognized me at once, and I inquired why he was not, as usual, crossing by air to Croydon. He laughed. The last time I crossed 3 weeks ago we went into a thick fog over the Channel, and it was not very comfortable. So I prefer the rail just now. On this occasion we exchanged cards. His name was Gaston Souzier, and between Paris and Calais we discussed many things, for he was a well-informed man and a true hater off box. On the steamer we strolled upon the deck together, and we passed quite a pleasant journey in company. He was surprised that I had been in Italy, but I explained that I had been granted long leave of absence by my firm, and that I had gone to Florence upon private affairs. We parted at Charing Cross, Monsieur Souzier to go to the Carlton, and I home to our little flat in Rivermead Mansions. A note lay upon the dining room table. Hambledon was away in Cardiff, and he had left word in case I should return unexpectedly. The place was cold and fireless, and I was glad to go over to the Clarendon to have my dinner. My one thought was of Gabrielle Tennyson, who lived with her mother in a maisonette at Earl's Court. So I took a taxi to Longridge Road, and after numerous inquiries at neighboring shops in Earl's Court Road, I discovered in which house lived Mrs. Tennyson and her daughter. The hour was late, therefore I felt that it was useless to keep observation upon the place in the hope of the girl coming forth. I had no excuse to make a call. Besides, I might, if I acted indiscreetly, destroy all my chances of solving the strange enigma. Therefore not until 10 o'clock on the following morning did I take up my vigilant watch at the end of the road, at a spot from which I had full view of the house in question. My watch proved a long and weary one, for not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon was my patience rewarded. The front door suddenly opened, and down the steps came the slim figure of a girl, followed by a woman. As they approached me I saw that it was the girl I had seen with Moroni in Florence, while the woman was, from her dress, evidently an old servant. The girl of mystery was attired quite smartly in black, her appearance being very different from the shabby figure she presented in Florence. But her beautiful countenance was just as pathetic, with that strange set expression of ineffable sadness. She passed me by without glancing at me, while the stout, homely woman at her side held her arm linked in hers. They turned into Earl's Court Road and walked towards Kensington High Street, while I followed at a respectable distance. I could not fail to notice the grace of carriage of the girl whose listless attitude was so mysterious, and whose exact whereabouts Oswald de Gex was concealing from his friend, Mrs. Cullerton. But the one point which puzzled me sorely was whether the girl walking in front of me, all unconscious of my presence, was the same that I had seen dead at Stretton Street, and for whom I had given a false certificate to cover up what had evidently been a crime with malice aforethought. The pair now and then became lost in the crowd of foot passengers in busy Kensington, but I followed them. Occasionally they paused to look into Barker's shop windows, but the interest was evidently on the part of the serving woman, for Gabrielle Tennyson, or whatever her actual name, seemed to evince no heed of things about her. She walked like one in a dream, with her thoughts afar off, yet her face was the sweetest, most beautiful, and yet the saddest I had ever witnessed. Tragedy was written upon her pale countenance, and I noticed that one or two men and women in passing the pair turned to look back at them. In that face of flawless beauty a strange story was written, a mystery which I was strenuously seeking to solve. Presently they entered Kensington Gardens, strolling along the gravelled walks beneath the bare, leafless trees that were so black with London's grime. The day was cold, but bright, hence quite a number of persons were walking there, together with the usual crowd of nursemaids with the children of the well-to-do from the Hyde Park and Kensington districts. The pair passed leisurely halfway up the broad walk, when they presently rested upon a seat nearly opposite the great facade of Kensington Palace. I saw that I had not been noticed either by the old servant or by her mysterious young mistress, therefore I sank quickly upon a seat some distance away, but in such a position that I could still see them as they talked together. Was Gabrielle Ingledew living, or was she dead? Or was Gabrielle Tennyson and Gabrielle Ingledew one and the same person? A living face is different from that of the same person when dead, hence the great problem presenting itself. It seemed as though in conversation the girl became animated, for she gesticulated slightly as though in angry protest at some remark of her companion, and then suddenly I had a great surprise. Coming down the broad walk I saw a figure in a grey overcoat and soft brown hat which I instantly recognized. He walked straight to where the pair were seated, lifted his hat, and then seated himself beside the girl. The man was my French friend, Susie. That they had gone there on purpose to meet him was now quite clear, for after a few moments the old woman laughed, rose, and walked on, in order to leave the girl alone with the Frenchman. What could be the meaning of that clandestine it was, or Monsieur Susier would have called at Long Ridge Road. Possibly they expected that they might be watched, hence they had met as though by accident at that spot where they believed they would not be observed. Gaston Susier was a shrewd, clever man. But what did this friendship with Gabrielle Tennyson denote? As I watched I saw him speaking very earnestly. For some time she sat with her gloved hands idly in her lap listening to his words without comment. Then she shook her head, and put up her hands in protest. Afterwards by her attitude she seemed to be appealing to him, while he remained obdurate and unperturbed. I longed to overhear their conversation, but in the fading light of that brief wintry afternoon it was impossible to approach closer. I could only sit and watch. My eyes were strained to see every gesture of the pair, now that the stout figure of the girl's companion had disappeared towards the Bayswater Road. In that oasis in the desert of aristocratic London one can obtain quite sylvan surroundings. True, the trees and vegetation are covered with a film of grime from the millions of smoking chimneys of the giant metropolis. Still Kensington Gardens ever possesses a charm all its own as a clandestine meeting place for well-born lovers and ill-born loafers, for nursemaids and soldiers, and for persons of both sexes who wished for a little quiet talk in the open air in order so often to clear a hectic atmosphere. Such I judged to be the case between Gaston Susier and Gabrielle Tennyson. At first the girl sat inert with downcast eyes listening to the man. But suddenly she raised her hands in quick protest again, and apparently became resentful, even angry. Then when he spoke some reassuring words she became calmer. As I sat there shrewdly watching, I could not help reflecting upon a still further problem which now presented itself. The very last person in the world whom I should have suspected of being connected with a strange affair at Stretton Street was my affable friend the French banker. I now began to wonder if my first meeting with him in the express train between York and King's Cross just before my amazing adventure had been simply by chance, or had it any connection between that meeting and the trap which had, without a doubt, been so cunningly prepared for me as I passed through Stretton Street to my uncle's house on the following evening. The fact that I had again met the mysterious Susie at the Gare du Nord, in Paris, just as I was on my way back to London to pursue further inquiries was, in itself, suspicious. I confess that I sat utterly bewildered. One thing was plain, namely, that he had no suspicion that I was keeping such close observation upon Gabrielle. I knew where she lived, and to me he had given his hotel address. At last, after quite 20 minutes of serious conversation, the stout, flat-footed servant returned, and after a few pleasant words with her, Susie rose, and raising his hat, left them. Instantly it occurred to me that, as I knew the girl's abode, it would be more useful perhaps to watch the movements of my friend the French banker. He took the path which skirted the lake, and then cut down the straight way which leads to Alexandra Gate into Rotten Row, while I followed him far behind, though I kept him well in sight. He went swiftly at a swinging pace, for he had apparently grown cold while seated there in the north wind. The ground was hard and frosty, and the sky grey and lowering, with every evidence that a snowstorm might be expected. He walked the whole length of Rotten Row, that leafy way which is so animated when social London disports itself in the season, and which on a black wintry afternoon, when the smart set are on the Riviera or in Egypt, is so dull and deserted. At Hyde Park Corner he turned along Piccadilly, until he hailed a passing taxi, to the driver of which he gave deliberate instructions. I glanced around, and very fortunately saw another disengaged taxi, which I entered, giving the man instructions to keep the other in view, with a promise of double fare. Instantly the man entered into the spirit of the enterprise, and away we went towards the Circus, and thence by way of Oxford Street to the Euston Road, where before a small private hotel quite close to the station Susie descended, and, paying the man, entered. For 3 hours I waited outside, but he did not emerge. Then I went to the Carlton, and from the reception clerk ascertained that Monsieur Susie was staying there, but he did not always sleep there. Sometimes he would be absent for 2 or 3 nights. He went away into the country, the smart young clerk believed. Hence I established the curious fact that Gaston Susie when in London had 2 places of abode, one in that best-known hotel, and the other in the obscurity of a frosy house patronized by lower-class visitors to London. What could be the motive, I wondered. I returned to the Carlton at midnight and inquired for Monsieur Susie. The night clerk told me that he had not yet returned. So I went back to the cold cheerlessness of Rivermead Mansions, and slept until the following morning. At each turn I seemed to be confronted by mystery which piled upon mystery. Ever before my eyes I saw that handsome girl lying cold and lifeless, and I had forged a certificate in the name of a well-known medical man, upon which her body had been reduced to ashes. That I had acted as accomplice to some cunning and deliberate crime I could not disguise from myself. It was now up to me to make amends before God and man, to strive to solve the enigma and to bring the guilty persons to justice. This was what I was endeavoring, with all my soul, to accomplish. Yet the point was whether Gabrielle Ingledew was really dead, or whether she still existed in the person of Gabrielle Tennyson. That was the first fact for me to establish. Next morning I rose early and gazed across the cold misty Thames to the great factories and wharves upon the opposite bank. The outlook was indeed dull and dispiriting. I stood recalling how Moroni had walked with a beautiful girl in the streets of Florence, unwillingly it seemed, for he certainly feared lest his companion be recognized. I also recollected the strange conversation I had heard with my own ears, and the curious attitude which little Mrs. Cullerton had adopted towards me, even though she had revealed to me the whereabouts of Gabrielle Tennyson. My breakfast was ready soon after 8 o'clock, and afterwards I went to Earl's Court to watch the house in Long Ridge Road. By dint of careful inquiries in the neighborhood I was told that Mrs. Tennyson had gone away a few days before to Paris, they believed. The young lady, Miss Tennyson, appears to be rather peculiar, I remarked casually to a woman at a baker's shop nearby, after she had told me that she served them with bread. Yes, poor young lady, replied the woman. She's never been the same since she was taken ill last November. They say she sustained some great shock which so upset her that her mind is now a little affected. Old Mrs. Alford, the servant there, Tells me that the poor girl will go a whole day and never open her mouth. She's like one dumb. How very curious, I remarked. I wonder what kind of shock it was that caused such a change in her? Was she quite all right before November? Perfectly. She was a bright, clever girl, and used often to come in here to me for chocolate and cakes. She was FFLL of life and merriment. It is really pathetic to see her as she is nowadays. She seems to be brooding over something, but what it is nobody can make out. Very remarkable, I said. I've noticed her about, and have wondered at her attitude like many others, I suppose. Yes. Her mother has taken her to a number of mental specialists, I hear, but nobody seems to be able to do her any good. They say she's suffered from some shock, but they can't tell exactly what it is, because the young lady seems to have entirely lost her memory over a certain period. Is Mrs. Tennyson well off? I asked. No, the reverse, I should think, the baker's wife replied. I've heard that Mr. Tennyson was a very rich man, but when he died it was found that he was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the widow was left very poorly off. It is curious what intimate knowledge the little tradespeople glean about their neighbors, even in London. From the woman I gathered one or two facts of interest. I inquired if Mrs. Tennyson had many visitors, whereupon she replied in the negative, and added, there used to be an Italian gentleman who called very often a few weeks ago. He often walked out with a young lady. Somebody said he was a doctor, but I don't know if he was. I asked the woman to tell me what he was like, when she gave me an accurate description of the mysterious doctor of the Via Cavezzo. So Moroni had visited her there in Long Ridge Road. I tried to ascertain if Gaston Souzier had been there also, but my informant had no knowledge of him. She had never seen him walking with Gabrielle Tennyson, as she had so often seen the Italian. I remained for nearly half an hour chatting, retiring, of course, when she was compelled to serve customers, and then I left her and walked round to the house in Long Ridge Road, where I watched a little while, and then returned to the Carlton. Chapter the 11th. The absolute facts. Monsieur Souzier has not yet returned, was the reply of the smart reception clerk when I inquired for the French banker. But he is often away for 2 or 3 days. I left the hotel, and taking a taxi to the Euston Road made a thorough examination of the high shabby house with its smoke-grimed lace curtains, a place which bore over the fanlight the words Private Hotel. In the broad light of day it looked a most dull, uninviting place, more so even than its neighbors. There are many such hotels in the vicinity of Euston Station, and this seemed the most wretched of them all, for the windows had not been cleaned for many months, while the steps badly wanted scrubbing. After I had thoroughly examined the place in front, I went round to the back, where I discovered, to my surprise, that the house had an exit at the rear through a mews into a drab, dull street which ran parallel. Then, for the first time, the thought occurred to me that on the previous day the Frenchman might have entered by the front door and passed out by the back into the next street. I waited an hour idling about, and then I went boldly to the door, and knocked. A black-haired, slatternly woman in a torn and soiled apron opened the door slightly. "We're full up," she snapped before I could speak. "We haven't any room to let." "I don't require a room," I replied politely. "I've called to see the French gentleman you have staying here, Monsieur Souzier." I thought she started at mention of the name, for she still held the door ajar as though to prevent me from peering inside. "We've got no French gent staying here, mistake." "But I saw him enter here last night," she replied. "You must have been mistaken," the woman said. "He might have gone next door. They have a lot of visitors." "But you are full up, eh?" "Yes, with our regular residents," she answered promptly. But from her nervousness of manner I knew she was not telling the truth. I was positive that Souzier had entered there, but she denied all knowledge of him. Why? Without a doubt, while I had waited for him to emerge, he had passed out by the back way. If so, was it possible that he had seen and recognized me, and wished to escape unseen? The house was certainly one of mystery. The woman was palpably perturbed by my inquiry, and she seemed relieved when I turned away with feigned disappointment. "TW next door," she suggested, and disappeared. As I walked along Euston Road in the direction of Tottenham Court Road, I fell to wondering whether that Frozy house was one of those which exist in various quarters of London where thieves and persons hiding from the police can find sanctuary, and whether Susie, knowing that I had seen him, had escaped me by passing through to the back and thus getting away. I longed to know the character of the serious conversation he had had with Gabrielle Tennyson. That indeed was my object to discover, hence that afternoon I still pursued my bold tactics, and at about 3 o'clock I rang the bell in Long Ridge Road. That act, the consequences of which I never dreamed, eventually brought upon me a strange and sensational series of complications and adventures so remarkable that I sometimes think that it is only by a miracle I am alive to set down the facts in black and white. The old woman servant, Mrs. Alford, opened the door, whereupon I said, "I trust you will excuse me, but as a matter of fact I am desirous of a few minutes' private conversation with you." She looked askance at me, and naturally. I was a perfect stranger, and servants do not care to admit strangers to the house when their mistress is absent. "I know that this is Mrs. Tennyson's house," I went on, "and also that you are left in charge of Miss Gabrielle. It is about her that I wish to consult you. I think I may be able to tell you something of interest," and I handed her my card. Mrs. Alford read the name, but at first she seemed rather disinclined to admit me. Indeed, not until I had further whetted her curiosity by again telling her that I could give her some interesting information, did she show me upstairs to the cozy maisonette on the first floor. It was a large house which had been divided into two residences, one the basement and ground floor, and the other the first and second floors. It was in the latter that Mrs. Tennyson lived. She ushered me into a pretty drawing room, small, but very tastefully furnished. In the adjoining room someone was playing a piano, no doubt it was Gabrielle. "Well, Mrs. Alford," I began. "I have ventured to call here because I have learned of Miss Gabrielle's unfortunate mental condition, and perhaps I may have a key to it." "What do you know something, sir?" asked the stout buxom woman, for the first time impressed by my seriousness. "Do you know anything of what happened?" "Perhaps," was my noncommittal reply. "But first, I wish you to respect my confidence. I know you'll do that in the interests of the poor young lady." "I'll do anything in her interests, sir," she replied, and invited me to take a seat. She herself remained standing, as a servant should. "Well, then, say nothing to your mistress, or to anyone else regarding my visit. First, I want you to answer one or two questions so as to either confirm or negative certain suspicions which I hold." "Suspicions of what?" she asked. "I will reveal those in due course," I replied. "Now, tell me what happened to Miss Gabrielle that she should be in her present mental state." "Nobody can tell, sir. She went out one evening in November to go to her dancing lesson, and was not seen again until 6 days later, when she was found on the Portsmouth Road halfway between Lafouque and Petersfield. She had evidently walked a considerable distance and was on her way towards London, when she collapsed at the roadside. A carter discovered her, gave warning to the police at Petersfield, and she was taken to the hospital, where it was found that her memory had entirely gone. She could not recognize her mother or anyone else." "On what date did she disappear?" I asked breathlessly. "On November the 7th. I held my breath. It was on the day of my startling adventure." "Would you describe to me the exact circumstances?" I asked eagerly. "I may be able to throw a very interesting light upon the affair." The woman hesitated. Perhaps it was but natural. "Well," she said at last, "my mistress is away. I think you ought to see her, sir." "Why, Mrs. Alford? You are the Tunnelsted servant of the family, and surely you know the whole facts." "I do," she answered in a low, tense voice. "They are most remarkable." "Then tell me all you know, and in return I will try to explain some matters which are no doubt to you and to Mrs. Tennyson a mystery." "Well, after tea on the day in question, the 7th of November, Miss Gabrielle went out to go to Addison Road to Mrs. Gill's dancing class. She was in the best of health and in high spirits because she had that morning received an invitation to go and stay with her cousin Leonora at Newmarket on the following Wednesday. As far as we know, she had not a single trouble in the world. She had no admirers. Yes, several. But she had no serious flirtations, as far as we can make out, replied Mrs. Alford. Her mother had gone to pay a visit, and when Miss Gabrielle went out she told me that she would be home at 9 o'clock. Though we waited till midnight she did not return. We remained up all night, and next morning when I went to Mrs. Gill, in Addison Road, I found that she had left there at 6:30 to return home. We then went to Kensington Police Station, and gave her description to the police. What was their theory? I asked. They thought she had left home of her own accord, that she had a lover in secret. At least, the inspector hinted at that suggestion. Of course her mother was frantic, I remarked. But had you no suspicion of any person posing as her friend? None. It was not till 6 days later, about 1 o'clock in the day, when a constable called and told Mrs. Tennyson that a young lady answering the description of her daughter had been found at the roadside, and had been taken to the cottage hospital at Petersfield. We both took the next train from Waterloo, and on arrival at the hospital found the poor girl lying in bed. But so strange was her manner that she was unable to recognize either of us. All she could say were the words red, green and gold, and she shuddered in horror as though the colors terrified her. These words she constantly repeated: red, green, and gold. Red, green and gold. What was the doctor's opinion? He was as much puzzled as we were, sir. Apparently my poor young mistress was found early in the morning lying in the hedge on the main Portsmouth road. Her clothes were wet, for it had rained during the night. Her boots were very muddy, and her clothes in an awful state. She seemed as if she had wandered about for hours. But all she could say to us were the words, red, green, and gold. Did not she recognize her mother? I inquired. No, sir. She hasn't recognized her even now. Doctors have seen her, I suppose, yes, half a dozen of them, including Dr. Moroni, the great Italian doctor. He took her to Florence for treatment, but it did her no good, none in the least. How did you know Moroni? I asked quickly. I think he became interested in her through one of the doctors to whom Mrs. Tennyson took her. Mrs. Tennyson did not know Moroni before this affair? I inquired. No, sir. Not to my knowledge. He's a very nice gentleman, and has been awfully kind to Miss Gabrielle, replied Mrs. Alford. Like all the other doctors, he thinks that she has sustained some very severe shock, but of what nature nobody can tell. What other doctor has seen her? I asked. Sir Charles Wendover, in Cavendish Square, has taken a great interest in her. He has seen her several times, but seems unable to restore her to her normal state of mind. Sir Charles was one of our greatest mental specialists, I knew, and if he had been unable to do anything, then her case must be hopeless. But Dr. Moroni took her away to Italy, I said. For what reason? He took her to Professor Casuto, of Florence, I think that's the name, but he could do nothing, so she was brought back again. Now tell me frankly, Mrs. Alford, I said, looking the stout, well-preserved woman full in the face. Have you ever heard the name of de Gex, a rich gentleman who lives in Stretton Street, just off Park Lane? De Gex, she repeated, her countenance assuming a blank expression. Yes, I've heard of him. I've read of him in the papers. He's a millionaire, they say. You have never heard of him in connection with Miss Tennyson? Is she acquainted with him? Not to my knowledge. Why do you ask? I have a distinct reason for asking, was my reply. Remember that I am seeking to solve the enigma of your young mistress's present extraordinary state of mind. Any information you can give me will assist me towards that end. As I spoke, I heard a sweet contralto voice in the adjoining room break out into a song from one of the popular revues. It was Gabrielle's voice, I knew. All the information I possess, sir, is at your disposal, the woman assured me. I only wished Mrs. Tennyson was here to answer your questions. But you know as much as she does, I said. Now tell me, what is your theory? What happened to your young mistress during the time she disappeared? Mrs. Alford lifted her hands in dismay. What can we think? She went away quite bright and happy. When she was found wandering on the road between London and Portsmouth, her memory was a blank. She was haggard, worn, and much aged in those few days of her absence. She could remember nothing, and all she could repeat were those strange words red, green, and gold. I wonder why those colors were so impressed upon her memory. I remarked. Odd. That is what puzzles the doctors so. Each evening, just as it grows dark, she sits down and is silent for half an hour, with eyes downcast as though thinking deeply. Then she will suddenly start up and cry, Odd. I see, yes, that terrible red, green, and gold. Oh. It's horrible, bewildering, fascinating red, green, and gold. The three colors seem to obsess her always at nightfall. That is what Dr. Moroni told me. I paused for a few moments. You've never heard her speak of Mr. de Gex? You're quite sure? Quite, was Mrs. Alford's reply. My young mistress was studying singing at the Royal Academy of Music. Hark! You hear her now. Has she not a beautiful voice? Ah, sir, it is all a great tragedy. It has broken her mother's heart. Only to think that today the poor girl is without memory, and her brain is entirely unbalanced. Red, green and gold is all that seems to matter to her. And whenever she recollects it and the words escape her drawn lips, she seems petrified by horror. What the woman told me was, I realized, the actual truth. And yet when I recollected that I had seen the dark-eyed victim lying dead in that spacious room in the house of Mr. de Gex in Stretton Street, I became utterly bewildered. I had seen her dead there. I had held a mirror to her half-open lips and it had not become clouded. Yet in my ears there now sounded the sweet tuneful strains of that bird song from Joy Bells. Truly, the unfortunate girl possessed a glorious voice, which would make a fortune upon the concert platform or the stage. I did my level best to obtain more information concerning the Italian doctor and the man de Gex, but the woman could tell me absolutely nothing. She was concealing nothing from me that I knew. It was only when I mentioned the French banker, Monsieur Souzier, that she started and became visibly perturbed. I have no knowledge of the gentleman, she declared. Yet had I not seen them together in Kensington Gardens? I don't know whether he is known to you as Souzier, I said. Then I described him as accurately as I could. But the woman shook her head. For the first time she now lied to me. With my own eyes I had seen the man approach her and the girl, and after they had greeted each other, she had risen and left the girl alone with him. Curiously enough, when the pair were alone together they seemed to understand each other. I recollected it all most vividly. To say the least, it was strange why, being so frank upon other details, she so strenuously denied all knowledge of the affable Frenchman who had been my fellow traveler from York almost immediately preceding my strange adventures in the heart of London. My conversation with her had been, to say the least, highly illuminating, and I had learned several facts of which I had been in ignorance. But this fixed assertion that she knew nothing of the elusive Frenchman aroused my suspicions. What was she hiding from me? I felt that she was concealing some very essential point, one that might well prove the clue to the whole puzzling enigma. And while we spoke the girl's clear contralto rang out, while she herself played the accompaniment. At length I saw that I could obtain no further information from the servant. Therefore I begged to be introduced to her young mistress, assuring her of my keen interest in the most puzzling problem. Apparently relieved that I pressed her no further regarding the handsome but insidious Frenchman, the woman at once ushered me into the adjoining room, a small but well-furnished one, where at the grand piano sat the girl whose eyes were fixed, though not sightless as I had believed when ill Florence. She turned them suddenly upon my companion, and stopped playing. All. Dear Alfred, she exclaimed, Elle wondered if you were at home. Then she paused. She apparently had no knowledge of my presence, for she had not turned to me, though I stood straight in her line of gaze. I thought you had gone out to see Monsieur to tell him my message. She again paused, and drew her breath. I stood gazing upon her beautiful face, dark, tragic and full of mystery. She sat at the piano, her white fingers inert upon the keys. She wore a simple navy blue frock, cut low in the neck with a touch of cream upon it, and edged with scarlet piping, a dress which at that moment was the mode. Yet her pale, blank countenance was indeed pathetic, a face upon which tragedy was. I stood for a moment gazing upon her, perplexed, bewildered and breathless in mystery. I spoke. She rose from her seat, and turned to me. Her reply, low and tense, staggered me. Chapter the 12th. Red, green, and gold. I know you, she cried, staring at me as though transformed by terror. They told me you would come. You are my enemy, you are here to kill me. To kill you, Miss Tennyson? I gasped. No, I am certainly not your enemy. I am your friend. She looked very hard at me, and I noticed that her lips twitched slightly. You are Mr. Garfield, Hugh Garfield, she asked, her hands veering nervously. Yes. That is my name, I replied. How do you know it? They told me. They told me in Florence. The doctor pointed you out. He told me that you were my worst enemy, that you intend to kill me. Dr. Moroni told you that? I inquired kindly. Yes. One day you were in the Via Tornabuoni and he made me take note of you. It was then that he told me you were a man of evil intentions, and warned me to be wary of you. I paused. Here was yet another sinister action on the part of Moroni. Besides, I was unaware that he had realized I had watched him. Ah. Yes, I see, I replied, in an attempt to humor her, for she was very sweet and full of grace and beauty. The doctor tried to set you against me. And yet, strangely enough, I am your friend. Why should he seek to do this? How can I tell, replied the girl in a strange blank voice. But he evidently hates you. He told me that you were also his enemy, as well as mine. He said that it was his intention to take steps to prevent you from seeking mischief against both of us. This struck me as distinctly curious. Though the poor girl's mind was unbalanced, it was evident that she could recollect some things, while her memory did not serve her in others. Of course it was quite feasible that Moroni, on discovering that I was on the alert, would warn her against me. Suddenly, hoping to further stir the chords of her memory, I asked, have you seen Mr. de Gex lately? Who? She inquired blankly. Mr. Oswald de Gex, who lives in Stretton Street. She shook her head blankly. I'm afraid one don't know him, she replied. Who is he? Surely you know Stretton Street? I asked. No, where is it? She inquired in that strange inert manner which characterized her mentality. I did not pursue the question further, for it was evident that she now had no knowledge of the man in whose house I had seen her lying apparently dead. And if she were not dead, whose body was it that had been cremated? That was one of the main points of the problem which, fry how I would, I failed to grasp. Would the enigma ever be solved? As she stood in her mother's cozy little drawing room, Gabrielle Tennyson presented a strangely tragic figure. In the grey London light she was very beautiful, it was UE, but upon her pale countenance was that terribly vacant look which was the index of her overwrought brain. Her memory had been swept away by some unknown horror, so the doctors had declared. And yet she seemed to remember distinctly what Dr. Moroni had alleged against me in Florence. Therefore I questioned her concerning the Italian, and found that she recollected quite a lot about him. He has been very kind to you, has he not? I asked. Yes. He is an exceedingly kind friend. He took me to see several doctors in Florence and Rome. All of them said I had lost my memory, and she smiled sweetly. And haven't you lost your memory? A little perhaps, but not much. Here Mrs. Alford interrupted. But you don't recollect what happened to you when you were away, until you were found wandering near Petersfield. Tell us, dear. No, not exactly, the girl answered. All I recollect is that it was all red, green, and gold. Oh, such bright dazzling colors, red, green and gold. At first they were glorious until sight of them blinded me. They seemed to burn into my brain. And she drew back and placed her right arm across her eyes as though to shut out from her gaze something that appalled her. There they are, she shrieked. I see them again, always the same, day and night, red, green, and gold, red, green, and gold. I exchanged glances with the woman Alfred. It was apparent that the shock the girl had sustained had been somehow connected with the colors red, green and gold. I tried to obtain from her some faint idea of the nature of what she had witnessed, but she was quite unable to explain. That she had fallen victim to some deep-laid plot was evident. She remembered much of her visit to Florence, I found, for when I recalled the great Duomo, where I had first seen her with Moroni, she became quite talkative and told me how much she admired the magnificent monuments, the Battistero, the Bigelow, Giotto's Campanile, and the magnificent pictures in the Pitti and Uffizi. Moroni had apparently also taken her to Rome, presumably to consult another Italian professor, for she spoke vaguely of the Corso and St. Peter's and described the Forum in such a manner that she must have visited it. While I sat chatting with her, it struck me that in the blank state of her mind certain things stood out very prominently, a mental state well known to alienists, while others were entirely blotted out. I referred to the millionaire who lived in Stretton Street, but again she declared, and with truth, that she had no recollection of him. Perhaps, Miss Tennyson, you knew him under some other name, I said, and then proceeded to describe minutely the handsome, rather foreign-looking man who had bribed me to give that certificate of death. Have you an uncle? I asked presently, recollecting that the man at Stretton Street had declared the victim to be his niece. I'll have an uncle, my mother's brother. He lives in Liverpool. Again I fell to wondering whether the beautiful girl before me was actually the same person whose death I had certified to be due to heart disease, and who, according to the official records, had been cremated. She was very like, and yet... Well, the whole affair was a problem which each hour became more inscrutable. Still the fact remained that Gabrielle Tennyson had disappeared suddenly on November the 7th, the night I had met with my amazing adventure. In reply to my further questions, as she sat staring blankly into my face with those great dark eyes of hers, I at last gathered that Dr. Moroni, hearing of her case from a specialist in Harley Street, to whom she had been taken by the police surgeon, had called upon her mother, and had had a long interview with her. Afterwards he had called daily, and later Mrs. Tennyson had allowed him to take her daughter to Florence to consult another specialist at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova. I think you know a Mrs. Cullerton, I remarked at last. The effect of my words upon her was almost electrical. Dolly Cullerton, she shrieked. Ah! Don't mention that woman's name. Please do not mention her. I believe that she was a friend of yours, I said, much surprised. Friend? No, enemy, a bitter enemy. Then you have Chwaneld? She was once your friend, eh? Over what have you quarreled? That is my own affair, she snapped in apparent annoyance. If you know her, don't trust her. I warn you. Then she added, she is a wicked woman. And her husband, Jack. He's an excellent fellow, far too good for her. Why do you entertain such antipathy toward her? I asked. Do tell me, because it will make my inquiries so very much easier. Inquiries? What inquiries are you making? I was silent for a moment, then looking straight into her eyes, I replied very seriously, I am making inquiries, Miss Tennyson, into what happened to you during those days when you disappeared. I am seeking to bring punishment upon those who are responsible for your present condition. She shook her head mournfully, and a faint smile played about her lips. But she did not reply. Tell me more about Mrs. Cullerton, I went on. She was in Florence when you were there? In Florence, exclaimed the girl, as though amazed. What could she be doing there? She was living in a furnished villa with her husband. And she went on several visits to Mr. de Gex, who lives up at Fiesole. Are you quite sure you do not know him? I asked. He lives at the Villa Clementini. Have you ever been there? Does the Villa Clementini recall anything to you? She was thoughtful for a few moments, and then said, I seem to have heard of the villa, but in what connection I do not recollect. You are certain you do not know the owner of the villa? I asked again, and described him once more very minutely. But alas! Her mind seemed a perfect blank. For what reason had Moroni come to London and taken her with him to Florence? But for the matter of that, what could be the motive of the whole puzzling affair, and further, whose was the body that had been cremated? The points I had established all combined to form an enigma which now seemed utterly beyond solution. The pale tragic figure before me held me incensed against those whose victims she had been, for it seemed that for some distinct reason her mental balance had been wantonly destroyed. Again and again, as she sat with her hands lying idly in her lap, she stared at the carpet and repeated to herself in a horrified voice those strange words, red, green and gold, red, green, and gold. Cannot you recollect about those colors? I asked her kindly. Try and think about them. Where did you see them? She drew a long breath, and turning her tired eyes upon mine, she replied wearily, I can't remember. I really can't remember anything. Sometimes her eyes were fixed straight before her, just as I had seen her in the Via Calzajoli in Florence when I had believed her to be blind. At such times her gaze was vacant, and she seemed to be entirely oblivious to all about her. At others she seemed quite normal, save that she could not recall what had occurred in those days when she was lost to her friends' days. When I, too, had been missing and had returned to my senses with my own memory either distorted or blotted out. Could it be that the same drug, or other diabolical method, had been used upon us both, and that I, the stronger of the two, had recovered, while she still remained in that half-demented state? It certainly seemed so. Hence the more I reflected, the more intense became my resolve to fathom the mystery and bring those responsible to justice. Further, she had been terrified by being told that I intended to come there to kill her. Moroni had purposely told her that, evidently in anticipation that we might meet. He had pointed me out in Florence and warned her that I was her bitterest enemy. Was it therefore any wonder that she would not tell me more than absolutely obliged? Do you recollect ever meeting a French gentleman named Monsieur Souzier? I asked her presently. Instantly she exchanged glances with a woman Alfred. No, was her slow reply, her eyes again downcast. I have no knowledge of any such man. It was upon the tip of my tongue to point out that they had met that mysterious Frenchman in Kensington Gardens, but I hesitated. They certainly were unaware that I had watched them. Again, my French friend was a mystery. I did not lose sight of the fact that our first meeting had taken place on the day before my startling adventure in Stretton Street, and I began to wonder whether the man from Paris had not followed me up to York and purposely joined the train in which I had travelled back to London. Why did both the woman Alfred and Gabrielle Tennyson deny all knowledge of the man whom they had met with such precautions of secrecy, and who, when afterwards he discovered that I was following him, had so cleverly evaded me? The man Souzier was evidently implicated in the plot, though I had never previously suspected it. Twice he had travelled with me, meeting me as though by accident, yet I now saw that he had been my companion with some set purpose in view. What could it be? It became quite plain that I could not hope to obtain anything further from either Gabrielle or the servant, therefore I assumed a polite and sympathetic attitude and told them that I hoped to call again on Mrs. Tennyson's return. Afterwards I left, feeling that at least I had gained some knowledge, even though it served to bewilder me the more. Later I called upon Sir Charles Wendover in Cavendish Square, whom I found to be a quiet elderly man of severe professional aspect and demeanor, a man whose photograph I had often seen in the newspapers, for he was one of the best known of mental specialists. When I explained that the object of my visit was to learn something of the case of my friend Miss Tennyson, he asked me to sit down and then switched on a green-shaded reading lamp and referred to a big book upon his writing table. His consulting room was dull and dark, with heavy Victorian furniture and a great bookcase filled with medical works. In the chair in which I sat persons of all classes had sat while he had examined and observed them, and afterwards given his opinion to their friends. "Ah! Yes," he exclaimed, when at last he found the notes he had made upon the case. "I saw the young lady on the 28th of November. A most peculiar case, most peculiar. Lester and Franklin both saw her, but they were just as much puzzled as myself." And through his big round horn spectacles he continued reading to himself the several pages of notes. Yes, he remarked at last. I now recall all the facts. A very curious case. The young lady disappeared from her friends, and was found some days later wandering near Petersfield, in Hampshire, in an exhausted condition. She could not account for her disappearance, or the state in which she was. Her memory had completely gone, and she has not, I believe, yet recovered it. No, she has not, I said. But the reason I have ventured to call, Sir Charles, is to hear your opinion on the case. My opinion, he echoed. What opinion can I hold when the effect is so plain loss of memory? Ah! But how could such a state of mind be produced? I asked. You ask me for the cause. That, my dear sir, I cannot say, was his answer. There are several causes which would produce a similar effect. Probably it was some great shock. But of what nature we cannot possibly discover unless she herself recovers her normal memories so far as to be able to assist us. I see that I have noted how she constantly repeats the words red, green and gold. That combination of colors has apparently impressed itself upon her mind to such an extent that it has become an obsession. Often she will utter no other words than those. She was seen by a number of eminent men, but nobody could suggest any cause other than shock. Is it possible that some drug could have been administered to her? Everything is possible, Sir Charles answered. But I know of no drug which would produce such effect. In brief, I confess that I have no idea what can have caused the sudden mental breakdown. I felt impelled to relate to him the whole story of my own adventures, but I hesitated. As a matter of fact, I feared that he might regard it, as he most probably would have done, as a mere chimera of my own imagination. A girl I had seen dead or believed I had seen dead was now living. And she was Gabrielle Tennyson. Of that I had no doubt, for the dates of our adventures corresponded. And yet a girl also named Gabrielle had died and her body had been cremated. The whole affair seemed to be beyond human credence. And yet you, my reader, have in this record the exact, hard, and undeniable facts. Chapter the 13th. Some interesting revelations. Next day I went to the office of Francis and Goldsmith, and after a consultation with both principals, during which I briefly outlined the curious circumstances such as I have here related, I was granted further leave of absence. Yet I entertained a distinct feeling that old Mr. Francis somewhat doubted the truth of my statements. But was it surprising, so extraordinary had been my adventures? Perhaps you do not credit my statements, gentlemen, I said before leaving the room. But one day I hope to solve the enigma, and you will then learn one of the most extraordinary stories that any man has lived to tell. Afterwards I went round to the Carlton and inquired for Monsieur Sousier. To my surprise he was in. Therefore I was ushered up to his private sitting room, where he greeted me very warmly. So frankly welcome did he make me, indeed, that I wondered whether, after all, he had detected me following him, or whether he had entered and escaped from that house in the Euston Road with some entirely different motive. "All, my dear friend," he cried in his excellent English. "L wondered what had become of you. I called at Rivermead Mansions 3 days ago, but I could get no reply when I rang at your flat. The porter said that both you and your friend were out, and he had no idea when you would return. I go back to Paris tomorrow. Shall you fly across this time?" I asked. "No, I go by train. I have a lot of luggage, some purchases I have made for my friend the Baroness de Hennenville." It was then about 5 o'clock, so he ordered some tea, and over cigarettes we chatted for nearly an hour. The longer I conversed with him the more mysterious he appeared. Why had he crossed from Paris to London with me in order to meet clandestinely the poor girl who was the rich man's victim? That was one point which arose in my mind. But the main question was the reason of his supposed chance meeting with me in the express between York and London. During our chat I feared to refer to Gabrielle lest he should suspect that I knew of his subtle intrigue. I could see that he was congratulating himself upon his cleverness in misleading me, therefore I chuckled inwardly. What I desired most at that moment was to establish the connection between the elegant cosmopolitan Frenchman and Oswald de Gex with his wily accomplice Moroni. That the latter was a man of criminal instinct I had long ago established. He was a toady to a man of immense wealth, a clever medical man who, by reason of his callous unscrupulousness, was a dealer in death in its most insidious and least looked for form. The hand of death is ever at the command of every medical man, hence mankind has to thank the medical profession, one of the hardest worked and least recognized in the world, for its honesty, frankness, and strict uprightness. In every profession we have black sheep, even, alas, in the church. But happily unscrupulousness in those who practice medicine in Great Britain is practically an unknown quantity. But in Europe it is different, for in the dossiers held by the police of Paris, Rome, Madrid, and Berlin, criminals who practice medicine are written largely, as witnessed by the evidence in more than one famous trial where the accused has been sentenced to death. I long to go to Scotland Yard and tell my story. Yet how could I do so when, in a drawer in my room, there reposed that bundle of Bank of England notes, the price paid to me for being the accomplice of a mysterious crime? I could only seek a solution of the enigma alone and unaided by the authorities. I seemed to be making a little headway, yet each fact I established added complications to the amazing affair. Further, I must here confess to you that during the past day or two I had found myself actually in love with a beautiful girl whose mentality had been willfully destroyed by some means which medical science failed to establish. From the first I had been filled with great admiration for her. She was indeed very beautiful, with wonderful eyes and a perfect complexion. There was grace in every movement, save when at times she held herself rigid, with fixed blank eyes as though fascinated, or gripped by some invisible power. More than once I had wondered whether she were under hypnotic influence, but that theory had been completely negatived by Sir Charles Wendover. Be that as it may, I had now fallen desperately in love with the girl whom I was seeking to rescue from her enemies. Why had the body of Gabrielle Ingledew been cremated if not to destroy all evidence of a crime? Gabrielle Tennyson still lived, therefore another woman must have lost her life by foul means, most probably by poison, in face of the pains that were taken by Moroni to efface all trace of the cause of death. Over our tea the affable French banker told me of a rapid journey to Liverpool which he had taken a few days before, he having some pressing business with a man who was on the point of sailing for New York. The person in question had absconded from Paris owing the bank a large sum of money, and he had that day cabled to the New York police asking for his arrest on landing. I shall probably be compelled to go across to America and apply for him to be sent back to Paris, my friend said, so I am going back for instructions. As he spoke I pondered. Was it possible that he was unaware of the surveillance I had kept upon him during and after his secret interview with Gabrielle? If so, why had he entered that dingy house in the Euston Road and made his exit by the back way? I had established the fact that the house was well known to thieves of a certain class who used it in order to escape being followed. Several such houses exist in London. One is near the Elephant and Castle, another in the Clapham Road, while there is one in Hammersmith Road, and still another just off Clarence Terrace at Regent's Park. Such houses serve as sanctuaries for those escaping from justice. Few know them, and as they slip through they pay a toll, well knowing that the keeper of the house will deny that they have ever been there. The in and out houses of London and their keepers, always sly crooks, form a particular study in themselves. One pretends to be a garage, another a private hotel, a third a small greengrocer's, and a fourth a boot repairer's. All those trades are carried on as blinds. The public believe them to be honest businesses, but there is far more business done in concealing those wanted by the police than in anything else. From Susier's demeanor I felt that he did not suspect me of having been witness of his entry into that frosy house near Euston Station. But why had he gone there? He must have feared that he might be watched. And why? The only answer to that question was that he had met Gabrielle clandestinely and feared lest afterwards he might be followed. But why should he fear if not implicated in the plot? To me it now seemed plain that I had been marked down as a pawn in a game prior to that day when we travelled together from York to London. I had not altogether recovered from the effect of what had been administered to me. Often I felt a curious sensation of dizziness and of overwhelming depression, which I knew was the after effects of that loss of all sense of my surroundings when I had been taken to the hospital in St. Malo. I had been found at the roadside in France, just as Gabrielle had been found on the highway near Petersfield. When I reflected my blood boiled. The affable and highly cultured Frenchman presented a further enigma. He was crossing back to Paris next day. What if I, too, went back to Paris and watched his further movements? As I sat chatting and laughing with him, I decided upon this course. When, shortly afterwards, I left, I went straight across Hammersmith Bridge and found that Harry Hambledon had just returned from his office. We sat together at table, whereupon I told him one or two facts I had discovered, and urged him to cross to Paris with me next day. You see, you can watch, for you will be a perfect stranger to Susie. I will bear the expense. I've still got a little money in the bank. We can see Susie off from Charing Cross, then take a taxi to Croydon, fly over, and be in Paris hours before he arrives at the Gare du Nord. There you will wait for his arrival, follow him and see his destination. Hambledon, who was already much interested in my strange adventures, quickly saw the point. I've got one or two rather urgent things on tomorrow, he replied. But if you really wish me to go with you, I can telephone to my friend Hardy and ask him to look after them for me. We shan't be away very long, I suppose. A week at the most, I said. I'll want to establish the true identity of this banker friend of mine. I have a distinct suspicion of him. And so have L, Hambledon said. Depend upon it, some big conspiracy has been afoot, and they are now endeavoring to cover up all traces of their villainy. I was discussing it with Nora when we were walking in Richmond Park last night. I'll quite agree, I replied. Then we'll fly across to Paris at lunchtime tomorrow, and keep watch upon this man who meets Miss Tennyson in secret and then uses a thieves' sanctuary in order to escape. That story of the absconding customer of the bank is a fiction, I believe, Harry exclaimed. I'm certain it is, I said. Then why should he have told it to you if he did not suspect that you had been watching, my friend queried. I had not considered that point. It was certainly strange, to say the least, that he should thus have endeavored to mislead me. Next morning Hambledon was up early and went to Charing Cross, where he watched the banker's departure. Afterwards he returned, and with our suitcases we travelled down to the London Terminal Aerodrome at Croydon, where, just before noon, we entered one of the large passenger aeroplanes which fly between London and Paris. Within half an hour of our arrival at the aerodrome we were already in the air sailing gaily southward towards Lympne, near Folkestone, where we had to report previous to crossing the channel. The morning was bright, and although cold the visibility was excellent. Below us spread a wide panorama of tiny square fields and small clusters of houses that were villages, and larger ones with straight roads running like ribbons through them, which were towns. The dark patches dotting the ground beneath us were woods and coppices, while running straight beneath was a tiny train upon the railway between Folkestone and London. There were 3 other passengers beside ourselves, apparently French businessmen, who were all excitement, it evidently being their first flight. Very soon we could see the sea, and presently we could also discern the French coast. As we approached Lympne the observer telephoned by wireless back to Croydon telling them of our position, and in a few moments we were high over the channel. At Marquise, on the other side, we again reported, and then following the railway line we sped towards Paris long before the express, by which the banker was travelling, had left Calais. Indeed, shortly before 3 o'clock we had installed ourselves at the Hotel Terminus at the Gare Saint-Lazare, in Paris, and afterwards took a stroll along the boulevards, awaiting the time when the express from Calais was due at the Gare du Nord. Shortly before 5:30 Hambledon left me and took a taxi to the station for the purpose of watching Susie's arrival and ascertaining his destination, which, of course, I feared to do, lest he should recognize me. It was not until past 9 o'clock that evening that my friend returned to the hotel. He described how Susie on arrival at the Gare du Nord had been met by a young English lady, and the pair had driven straight to the Rodin restaurant at the corner of the Boulevard Haussmann, where they had dined together. Elle dined near them, and one could see plainly that their conversation was a very earnest one, declared my companion. She seemed to be relating something, and apparently was most apprehensive, while he, on his part, seemed gravely perplexed. Though he ordered an expensive meal they scarcely touched it. They sat in a corner and spoke in English, but I could not catch a single word. In response to my request he described Susie's lady friend. Then he added, she wore only one ornament, a beautiful piece of apple green jade suspended round her neck by a narrow black ribbon. When they rose and the waiter brought their coats, I heard him call her Dorothy. Dorothy Cullerton. I gasped. I recollect that piece of Chinese jade she wore in Florence. What is she doing here, meeting that man clandestinely? The man slipped something into her hand beneath the table and she put it into her handbag, Hambledon said. I have a suspicion that it was a small roll of French banknotes. Payment for some information, perhaps, I said. I don't ust that young stockbroker's wife. Well? I asked. And what then? On leaving the Rodin they drove to the Rue de Rivoli, where the lady alighted and entered the Hotel Wagram, while he went along to the Hotel du Louvre, was his reply. I was much puzzled at the secret meeting between the affable Frenchman and young Mrs. Cullerton, and next day by watching the entrance to the Hotel Wagram, which was an easy matter in the bustle of the Rue de Rivoli. I satisfied myself that my surmise was correct, for at 11 o'clock she came forth, entered a taxi, and drove away. My next inquiry was at the head office of the Credit Lyonnais, in the Boulevard des Italiens, but, as I suspected, the name of my French fellow-traveler was unknown. We have no official of the name of Suzier, replied the polite assistant director whom I had asked to see. The gentleman must be pretending to be associated with us, monsieur. It is not the first time we have heard of such a thing, so it was apparent that Suzier was not a bank official after all. In the meantime Hambledon was keeping watch at the Hotel du Louvre, and it was not until afternoon that he rejoined me to report what had occurred. It seemed that Suzier had, just before noon, strolled to the Grand Café, where he had met a well-dressed man who was awaiting him. They took coffee together, and then entering a taxi drove out to the Bois, where at the Pré Catelan they were joined by a smartly dressed young woman who was, no doubt, an actress. The three sat talking for a quarter of an hour, after which the two men left her and returned to a small restaurant in the Boulevard Saint-Martin, where they took their déjeuner. Afterwards Suzier had returned to his hotel. At my suggestion my companion had become on friendly terms with the under-concierge, who had promised to inform him if Monsieur Suzier should chance to be leaving. It was well that he had arranged this, for when at 6 o'clock Hambledon again went to the hotel the man in uniform told him that Monsieur Suzier was leaving the Quai d'Orsay at 11 o'clock that night by the Direct Express for Madrid. I saw that for me to travel to Spain by the same train as the man who had posed as a banker would be to court exposure. Hence Hambledon volunteered to travel to the Spanish capital in all secrecy, while I promised to join him as soon as he sent me his address. That journey was destined to be an adventurous one indeed, as I will duly explain to you, but its results proved more startling and astounding than we ever anticipated. Chapter the 14th. The Gate of the Sun. The spring morning was grey and rather threatening as I left the Hotel de la Paix in Madrid and walked from the Puerta del Sol past the smart shops in the Carrera de San Geronimo and across the broad handsome Plaza de Canovas, in order to meet Hambledon at a point which he had indicated in the Retiro Park. Late on the previous night I had arrived in the Spanish capital, and while Hambledon was at the Palace Hotel in the Plaza de Canovas I had gone to the Paix il the Puerta del Sol. I had been in Madrid only once before in my life, and as I walked through the gay thoroughfares I recalled that proud saying of the Madrileños, de Madrid al cielo y en el cielo un ventanillo para ver a Madrid, from Madrid to heaven, and in heaven a loophole to look at Madrid. The Spanish capital today is indeed a very fine city, full of life, of movement, and of post-war prosperity. Crossing the Prado, where the trees were already in full leaf, I took that straight broad way which led past the Royal Academy, and again crossing the Calle de Alfonso XII came to the Alcahofa fountain, the fountain of the artichoke, near which I waited for the coming of my friend. I stood there upon ground that was historic, and as I gazed around upon that sylvan scene, I wondered what would be the result of our long journey from Rivermead Mansions. That beautiful park which, in the 17th century, had been laid out with such taste by the Conde Duque de Olivares, the favorite of Philip IV, had been the scene of innumerable festivals which swallowed millions of money, and gave rise to many biting pasquinas and coplas. Today it is the Hyde Park of Spanish society. There all the latest Paris fashions are seen at the hour of the promenade, and everybody who is anybody in Spain must be seen walking or riding along its picturesque paths. I had not long to wait for Hambledon, for after a few moments his familiar sturdy figure came into sight. "Well, Hughie," he exclaimed, as we sank upon a seat together. There's some deep game being played here, I'm certain. What game? I asked quickly. Ah, I can't yet make it out, he replied. But I'll tell you what's occurred. Susie on arrival, went to the Ritz, where he has a private suite, and after I had watched him safely there I took up my quarters at the palace on the other side of the square, and started to keep a watch upon our friend. I got the concierge at the Ritz to do something for me for which I paid him generously, so as to pave the way for information concerning Susie in case we may want it. Good, I said. There's nothing like making friends with a concierge. He knows everything about the visitors to his hotel, and about their friends also. Well, on the first day Susie did not go out at all. But on the second morning at about 11 o'clock, he came forth very smartly dressed, and strolling along the Calle de Alcalá turned into the Grand Café where an elderly lady dressed in black was awaiting him. She was Spanish, without a doubt. He greeted her with studied courtesy and then sat down opposite her at the little table and ordered aperitifs. They conversed together in low, earnest tones. She seemed to be questioning him, while he gave rather hesitating replies. It seemed to me that he had come to Madrid in order to meet her. Therefore when after about half an hour they parted, I followed the lady. She took a cab and drove to the North Station, where she took a ticket for Segovia which I found was about 60 miles from here. I, of course, entered another compartment of the train and in about 3 hours we reached our destination. At the station she was met by a handsome young girl, who began to ply her with questions to which the elder woman replied in monosyllables as the pair ascended the pretty tree-lined boulevard that led into the picturesque town perched as it is upon a rock between two streams. Halfway up the Paseo, just prior to entering the ancient city so full of antiquities, the two ladies went in the gates of a large white house, evidently the residence of someone of importance. Unseen, I watched the door as it was opened by a manservant who bowed to them as he admitted them. Afterwards I passed into that most venerable city of Castile where I found a hotel called the Europeo, where I ordered a meal. The waiter spoke broken English, and when I described the big white house in the Paseo Ezequiel González and inquired who lived there he replied that it was the Condesa de Camarden with her niece Sahora de Carmen Flores. The countess was the widow of an immensely wealthy Spaniard who had died leaving most of his money away from his wife. There were rumors afloat both in Segovia and in Madrid where he had had a fine house that the widow was now in quite poor circumstances. Yet the Conde de Camarden had been one of the richest men in Spain. Then I came back and telegraphed to you in Paris. What has Susie done since? Practically nothing. He hardly ever goes out in the daytime, which shows me that he is no stranger in Madrid. Yet almost every evening after dinner he goes alone to one or other of the theaters, or to the variety show at the Trianon. Last night he was at Two Trovatore, at the Teatro Real. Alone. Always alone. Then why has he come here, to Madrid? I queried. In order to meet the Condesa de Camarden. But he has already met her. She came from Segovia to keep that appointment, hence one would think he would have returned to Paris by this time. We can only watch, Hambledon replied. L will continue my surveillance, but you had better be seen about as little as possible. He might meet and recognize you. Should I discover anything, or should I want to see you, I will either telephone to you at your hotel, or we will meet again at this spot. Thus it was arranged, and half an hour later we parted. I walked back to my hotel, my thoughts occupied by the beautiful girl who had suddenly so possessed me. Before me, by day and by night, rose visions of the lovely countenance of that strange, half-bewildered expression which was so pathetic and so mysterious. I recollected her sweet smiles when we had talked in her mother's drawing-room in Long Ridge Road, and I knew that my admiration had already ripened into love. But it was all so mysterious, so incredible indeed, that I hardly dared reflect upon those amazing events of the immediate past. The name of the great financier, de Gex, was one to conjure with all over Europe. Since my night's adventure in Stretton Street I had learned much concerning him. His nationality was obscure. He posed as an Englishman, but at the same time he was a Frenchman, an Italian, and a Greek. His financial tentacles were spread throughout Europe. Fabulously wealthy, he held a controlling interest in a number of banks and great industrial concerns, and it was said that he knew the capitals of the world as a milkman knows the streets of his particular suburb. Behind the smoke clouds of great events his intriguing figure followed unseen, unheralded, influencing dynasties through his secretaries and agents, one of whom was prime minister of a foreign kingdom and financing bankrupt states. Now and then he emerged from the retirement of the Villa Clementini and would go to Paris, Brussels, or Rome, and there entertain most lavishly ministers and aristocrats of various nations, and frequently give them presents at the dinner table. One man declared to me that Oswald de Gex was the friend of mighty persons and the molder of mighty events. He was a man of mystery who quietly and in secret juggled the destinies of nations in his gilded fingers. Wherever money has the power to speak, there Oswald de Gex would be found, smiling an inscrutable mysterious smile, but always the center of intrigue and adventure. To outwit and expose such a man I was determined. Back in the hotel I stood at the window of my room, gazing out across the busy plaza upon the fine Ministerio de la Gobernación, with its great clock upon the facade. The gateway of the rising sun is ever a scene of animation, and the more so on a fiesta, which it happened to be that day. I stood there looking blankly out upon the center of Madrid life. It was irksome to be compelled to remain in the hotel during the daytime for fear of recognition by the man Suzier. Why had he held that secret meeting with the widow of the wealthy Count Camardin? Hambledon had certainly acted with discretion and prompted it in following the lady in black to her home in Segovia. Could the Frenchman's visit to Madrid be in any way connected with the affair at Stretton Street? A new and highly interesting feature had arisen in the fact which I had only recently discovered, that Suzier had apparently traveled with me from York to London on that well-remembered afternoon with some set and distinct purpose. He had been most affable, and he had told me all about himself, a story which I now knew to be fictitious. In return, I suppose I had told him something about myself, but the exact conversation had long ago escaped my memory. I had had no suspicion that the man who had posed as an important official of one of the best-known of French banking corporations was in any way associated with the mysterious Oswald de Gex, until I had seen him meet in secret the girl with whom I had fallen so violently in love. I tried to analyze my feelings towards Gabrielle Tennyson, but failed utterly. I loved her, and loving her so well, I now set my whole soul upon elucidating the mystery. Truly, the problem was most puzzling, presenting further complications at every turn. Through the day I idled about the big hotel, occupying my time in writing letters and reading the papers. The café below in the late afternoon was crowded, for on the day of a fiesta Madrid is always agog with life and movement. When night fell and I ate my solitary dinner in the big restaurant, where I specially ordered an olla with garbanzos, a dish so dear to the Spanish palate and which cannot be procured beyond the confines of King Alfonso's kingdom. The waiter aided me, of course, and he smiled contentedly when I gave him his propina. Around me there dined as smart a set of people as those who frequented the Carlton in London, and perhaps the toilettes were even more elaborate. In certain feminine details the West End can be eclipsed both by modern Madrid and Bucharest, while Paris remains where she has ever been, the inventor of feminine fashion and the alluring city of light. In Madrid today one has all the pre-war prosperity combined with post-war extravagance. The latest mode of the Rue de la Paix is seen at the Ritz in Madrid almost before it is seen at Armenonville, and it becomes only second-hand when it has filtered through Dover Street or Petticoat Lane, as that thoroughfare is termed by truculent London bachelors. After dinner I spent an hour at the gay Café Iberia, in the Carrera de San Geronimo, and returned early to the hotel. As I entered the concierge met me with a note. It was from Harry Hambledon, written an hour before, urging me to meet him at the Gato Negro Café, the Black Cat, in the Calle del Principe. I lost no time in keeping the appointment, and on meeting my friend, he whispered excitedly. Suzier has a visitor. He arrived at the Ritz at 6 o'clock, and they have dined together. He is a well-dressed man of between 40 and 50, rather sallow-faced, and has given his name at the hotel as Henri Thibon, rentier, of Bordeaux. Aged nearly 50, sallow. I echoed. Are his features of a rather oriental cast, a dark, handsome man with deep-set eyes and a dimple in the center of his chin? I asked eagerly. Yes. That just describes him. De Gex? I gasped. Then he is here? After dinner they went out to the Trianon. They are there now. Then we will watch them return to the Ritz, I said. We spent an hour together in the cafe, after which we rose and walked through the well-lit streets and along beneath the trees of the Prado until we came to the great plaza where, opposite the Neptune fountain, the fine hotel stands back behind its gardens. We both halted against the colossal fountain, the waters of which were plashing into the great basin, and found that from where we were standing we had a good view of the entrance to the hotel. That the theaters were over was proved by the number of cars and taxis that were depositing people in evening dress who had come to the Ritz to supper. Hence we had not long to wait before we distinguished Suzier and his companion, both in dinner jackets, strolling on foot across the plaza from the Calle de Cervantes in the direction of the hotel. In an instant I recognized the form of the mysterious owner of the house in Stretton Street. Yes, I cried. I'm not mistaken. But why is he here under the name of Thibon? Without a doubt he is known in Madrid. Why should he seek to conceal his identity? We are here to discover the motive of his journey from Italy. According to his passport he arrived from Iran. But if he had come direct from Italy he would have come from the south, from Barcelona, most probably. He has a house in Paris. No doubt he has followed his friend Suzier from there. It will be interesting to watch. As I spoke the pair passed up the steps of the hotel and were lost to sight, therefore we turned and retraced our steps along the wide Carrera de San Geronimo to my hotel where, for an hour, Hambledon sat in my room discussing the situation. He suggested that he should move from the Palace Hotel to the Ritz, which was only just opposite. At first it seemed a good idea, but on reflection I did not agree, because I feared lest he might be recognized by Suzier. De Gex, of course, would not know him, but with Suzier the danger of recognition was always great. If either realized that they were being watched, all chances of solving the problem would instantly disappear. Only by secret and patient watchfulness could we discover the motive of that amazing affair near Park Lane, and again the TLLLTH of what actually occurred on that fateful November night. There is no doubt some further devil's game is in progress here, I declared, as Harry sat upon my bed smoking a cigarette, while I was stretched in an easy chair. And it is up to us to discover what it is, and whether it has any bearing upon the plot against poor Gabrielle Tennyson. Yes, agreed Hambledon. We must watch all their actions, for it is now evident that this fellow Suzier is deeply implicated in the conspiracy, whatever its nature. Chapter the 15th. The Intruder. During the next few days I remained idle in the hotel, not daring to go out while it was light, and leaving the surveillance upon De Gex and his friend to my old friend Hambledon. Each night we met at one cafe or another as we appointed, when he would report to me what he had witnessed during the day. It seemed that De Gex, or Monsieur Thibon, as he preferred to call himself, shared Suzier's private sitting room and, curiously enough, he also did not go out in the daytime. After all, that was not surprising, for such a great figure in international finance was probably well known in the Spanish capital. I had learned that he had had a hand in the finances of Spain, and had made some huge profits thereby. This man of mystery and intrigue was, I felt, there in Madrid with some malice aforethought. The very fact that he feared to be recognized was in itself sufficient proof. On the other hand, Suzier now went out in the daytime, going hither and thither as though transacting business for his friend. Hambledon had reported to me how he had sent 3 cipher telegrams by wireless from the Correo Central in the Calle Carretas. The first was to London, the second on the following noon to an address in Paris, and the third at 1 o'clock in the morning to Moroni in Florence. The message to the latter was in figures, groups of 5 numerals as used by the British Admiralty. Besides, he had also posted several letters in that big box at the chief post office marked Extranjero. The message to Moroni was highly suspicious. Harry Hambledon, as a solicitor, was, of course, a very acute person, and in addition he had very fortunately entered into the TME spirit of the adventure. Though he longed to be back again at Richmond with his pretty fiancée, Nora Payton, yet the mystery of the whole affair had bewildered him, and he was as keen as I was myself in elucidating the strange enigma. Moroni was no doubt a tool in the hands of that quiet, sallow-faced man who, by reason of his colossal wealth and huge financial resources, could even make and unmake dynasties. Oswald de Gex, the man who without nationality or patriotism pulled 100 financial strings both in Europe and in America, held the sinister Dr. Moroni in his pay. I could discern that fact, just as I could see that the man Suzier, who had so cleverly posed as an official of the Credit Lyonnais, was one of the many confidential agents of the mysterious de Gex. One evening I went, by appointment, to the Nuevo Club, to which I had been admitted as a foreign member, and in the smoking room I awaited Hambledon. At last he came through the big swing doors, and approaching me, excitedly exclaimed, "They've both gone out to Segovia to see the Countess de Camartin. De Gex sent a wire early this morning and then, on receipt of a reply, they hired a car and drove out to keep the appointment." Camartin was a Spanish financier. De Gex is one of international fame, a millionaire, I remarked. The wits of de Gex are perhaps pitted against the widow and the executors of the dead man. Don't you agree? Entirely, was Hambledon's reply. I follow the trend of your thoughts, Hugh. De Gex is the controlling influence of great events, but why should he seek to send you into an asylum for the insane? With the same motive that he endeavored to send into such an asylum poor Gabrielle Tennyson, I said bitterly. In law we have an old adage which says discover the motive and you also discover the miscreant, Harry remarked. I agreed, and, as much bewildered as he, exclaimed, well, as far as we can discern there is something very underhand in this meeting. But the Count's widow is a cheery, easy-going person, despite her mournful black, and perhaps, after all, we may be upon a double-tongued scent. Exactly. De Gex may be attracted by her handsome niece, the Señorita Carmen Flores. He may. But as the dead Count was a great financier, Oswald de Gex may be working in the interests of the widow or to the contrary. To the contrary, said my friend without hesitation. Next morning Hambledon told me that de Gex and Suzier did not return to the Ritz until nearly 1 o'clock. Apparently they had dined and spent the evening in Segovia. On that same day at noon, my curiosity aroused, I took train to the old world town with its wonder-all cathedral, the Alcazar, and the aqueduct built by Augustus, the largest piece of Roman work extant in Spain, rivaling as it does the walls of Tarragona. Without difficulty I discovered the fine country house of the Countess de Camartin situated high up on the broad tree-lined paseo. She had never seen me, therefore I had no hesitation in idling in the vicinity, in order to catch sight of her or her niece, their descriptions having been given to me by my friend Hambledon. Till it was growing dark I waited in vain, when suddenly I had a very narrow escape. A big dusty grey limousine came rapidly up the hill and halted close to where I was standing. From it there alighted Gaston Suzier, who without hesitation entered the big iron gates and disappeared into the garden. Fortunately he was in such haste, and so preoccupied that he did not notice me, hence I crossed the road and hid behind a half-ruined wall, where I had a good view of the car. About 20 minutes later he emerged again, and with him was a young girl wearing a small toque and a rich sable coat. No second glance was needed to realize that it was the Señorita Carmen Flores, niece of the Countess. The elegant Frenchman held the door open politely for her, and after she had entered he got in beside her, whereupon the car turned and went down the hill and out of sight. It occurred to me that Suzier had come from Madrid to fetch her, and that surmise later proved to be correct, for on returning to the capital at 10 o'clock Hambledon called at the Hotel de la Paix, and as we sat upstairs in my bedroom he informed me that the young girl had arrived by car at the Ritz and had dined with de Gex and his companion. The Countess, who had apparently been in Madrid since the morning, and who had attended a charity matinee at the Comedia, had arrived at the Ritz a quarter of an hour before her niece. It was evident, therefore, that they were well known to de Gex, who, as I afterwards ascertained, had been a friend of the late Count. The four had dined privately together in Suzier's sitting room, and according to the information given to Hambledon by the concierge, a number of papers had been produced and examined immediately after the coffee had been served. I'll understand that the production of the papers had a most disturbing effect upon the Countess, Hambledon told me. She gave vent to a cry of amazement, and afterwards burst into a fit of tears. At least that is what the waiter told the concierge. The Countess is very well known at the Ritz, for she moves in the court circle, and is often at the smart functions so constantly held there. And the niece? I asked. She is certainly both smart and good-looking. I can discover but little concerning her, Harry replied. She is not known at all. She has apparently only gone to live with her aunt at Segovia since the Count's death. I wonder what was in the papers which so affected the lady, I remarked. The Gex evidently invited them to dinner in order to make some disclosure, and to prove it by the production of documents. Evidently, replied my companion. In any case, the Countess and her niece have just started to return for home, the widow being very upset at what has been revealed to her tonight. What can it have been, I wonder? Could not the waiter ascertain the nature of the disclosure? No, I saw him myself afterwards, and he explained that the documents in question were produced just after he had left the room. He heard the Countess utter a cry of dismay, and when he again entered the room in pretense of clearing away the coffee cups, he found the lady in tears, while her niece declared hotly in French, "I do not believe it. I will never believe it." A number of legal documents were spread out upon the table, and de Gex was holding one of them in his hand. Then the object of the visit of the precious pair seems to have been to disclose some hitherto well-guarded secret to the widow of the Spanish financier L. Yes, my friend agreed. It certainly seems so, and then he rose and left. Downstairs in the Palm Court the gay crowd was pouring through to the restaurant for supper after the theater, for smart Madrid is gay at night, and there is as much dancing and fun there, on a smaller scale of course, as there is in the West End. The pretty dresses, the laughter, the sibilant whispers, and the claw-hammer code are the same in Madrid and Bucharest as in London or Paris, or any other capital. The hour of midnight is the same hour of relaxation when even judges smile after their day upon the bench, and the blue stocking will laugh at a risky story. So after Harry had gone, refusing to have supper with me lest somebody should notice us together, I strolled about, and selecting a table in the corner, ate my solitary meal, having had no dinner that day. It was past midnight before I ascended in the lift to my room. I undressed and when in bed I read the Heraldo until I suppose I dropped off to sleep. I knew nothing until later I was awakened by some slight movement. In an instant I was seized by a strange intuition of danger, and my wits became acute. Next second I was on the alert. There had been 3 lights burning when I retired, now there was but one. I had bolted my door, yet it was now slightly ajar. I lay and listened. Outside I heard the hum of a car receding across the great square. Afterwards the church bell began to clang discordantly, as they all do in Spain. The light was over the dressing table in the corner, and so shaded that the room was quite dim. Someone had been in my room. I grasped my automatic pistol which I kept under the pillow, and jumping out of bed crossed to the dressing table where I had put my watch and banknote case on taking them from my pocket. As I did so I heard the click of an electric light switch, and next instant the room was in darkness. For a second I was nonplussed. I knew, however, that I was not alone in the room, so I dashed across to the door, my pistol in my hand, and gaining it before the intruder could escape, turned on the lights. Before me stood revealed a tall, thin-faced, dark-haired man in his shirt and trousers who, seeing my pistol, at once put up his hands, crying in Spanish, "All. No, no. It is a mistake. Holy Madonna. I have mistaken the room. I thought my friend Pedro was here. 1,000 apologies, sire. 1,000 apologies. But my door was bolted. How did you get in?" I demanded fiercely. "No, sire. It was not bolted. I have been taken very unwell. I was seeking my friend Pedro," he stammered, pale and frightened. "Come to my room, and I will show you my papers to prove that I am no thief, but a well-known advocate of Burgos." I told him roughly to turn his face to the wall while I went through my belongings to satisfy myself that nothing had been stolen. All seemed in order, and the fellow's explanation seemed to be quite feasible save for the fact that I distinctly remembered bolting the door. Nevertheless I began to wonder whether I had not misjudged him. "Come along to my room, señor," he urged. "I will show you my identity papers. I have to offer you 1,000 apologies." I followed him to a room near the end of the corridor, where he quickly produced documents and papers showing that his name was Juan Salavera, an advocate, who lived in the Calle de Vitoria, in Burgos. He showed me the portrait of his wife and child which he carried in his wallet and a small painted miniature of his mother, and other proofs of his integrity, including a case well filled with notes. "I'll trust, Sapphire, that you will no longer accuse me of being a thief," he said. Our encounter would have been distinctly amusing had we not so frightened each other as we have done. I laughed, for I felt convinced that he was a respectable person, and I really began to feel uncomfortable. Indeed, I muttered an apology for my rather rough behavior, and at the same time I noticed upon the left side of his neck a deep scar probably left by an abscess. "My dear Seigneur, it was quite forgivable in the circumstances," he declared, offering me a cigarette and taking one himself. "I had supper at a restaurant after the theater tonight and ate something which had disagreed with me. Half an hour ago I felt faint, so I rose and went to find my friend Pedro Espada, who came with me from Burgos, and I entered your room in mistake. He must be in the room next yours. Shall we seek him?" I asked. "No. I feel much better now, thanks," was his reply. "The fright has chased away all faintness. Besides, we should have to go down to the office and ascertain in which room he really is." "I shall be all right now," he assured me. He went on to say that he had come to Madrid in connection with a large estate in Granada, to which a client of his had laid claim. "I shall be here for a week at least, therefore I hope you will give me the pleasure of spending an evening with Pedro and myself. We will dine at a restaurant and go to one of the variety theaters afterwards." I thanked him, and laughing at our encounter we parted quite good friends. On returning to my room I examined the bolt, and found that the screws of the brass socket had been forced from the woodwork and it was lying on the floor. That fact caused suspicion to again arise in my mind. Surely considerable force must have been used to break away the socket from the woodwork. Yet I had heard nothing. However, I returned to bed, and leaving the lights on I reflected upon the strange episode. The fellow's excuse was quite a legitimate one, yet I could not put from myself the fact that the door had been forced. By whom, if not by him? And yet he was so cool it seemed impossible that he was a thief whom I had caught red-handed. After half an hour I rose again and thoroughly examined the bolt, when my suspicion was increased by a strange discovery. In my absence the socket of the bolt had been removed, the screw holes enlarged and filled up with bread kneaded into a paste. Into this the screws had been placed so that although I had bolted the door I could not secure it, for the smallest pressure from outside would break the fastening from the woodwork. The dodge was one often practiced by hotel thieves. But what proof had I that the lawyer from Burgos had prepared that bolt? I had no means of knowing when the screws had been rendered unstable, or by whom. It might have been done even before I had occupied that room, for the paste was hard and crumbling. Nevertheless the fact remained that my door had been prepared for a midnight theft, and I had found a stranger in my room. So with a resolve to make further inquiry next morning, I threw myself down and slept. I must have been tired and overwrought, for it was past 9 o'clock when I awoke and drew up the blinds. Then as I crossed to ring the bell for my coffee and hot water I made a very curious discovery. Chapter the 16th. Another strange disclosure. On the ground, close to my bed, were 3 brass-headed carpet pins which had apparently spilled accidentally out of a box. The sharp point of each was upturned, and it was a marvel that during the night I had not stepped upon them. How had they come there? Was it by accident or design that they were beside my bed? At first I wondered whether the hotel upholsterer had been at work on the previous day and had left them behind. He might have used them for pinning down my carpet. I took one up and examined it. Next second I stood aghast. The others I also took up, handling them very gingerly, for around the points of each was some colorless transparent substance which looked like Vaseline. Such a substance was not ordinarily upon the points of carpet pins. A horrible thought flashed across my mind. Therefore I carefully placed the 3 pins upon the small glass tray upon the dressing table, and dressed as quickly as I could, reflecting the while upon my adventure with a stranger whom I had taken to be a thief. I shaved, swallowed the coffee which the young waiter brought me, and at once descended to the bureau, when in French I inquired of the clerk for Señor Salavera. He examined the register and replied politely, "We have no one oft-hat name staying here, Sapphire." "What? I cried. He was in room 175 last night. Number 175 was Seahorse Solier, replied the smart young clerk. He paid his bill and left just after 7 o'clock this morning. But I saw his identification papers, his passport letters addressed to him as Seahorse Olivera. That may be so, Sire, was the suave reply. But he registered here as Seahorse Solier. And then he dropped into English, which he spoke very fairly. Of course, people who stay at hotels do not always give their correct names. They do not wish them published in visitors' lists in the newspapers. Perhaps it is only natural, and he smiled. Have you anyone named Pedro Espada in the hotel? I inquired. Again he consulted his register, but shook his head. Nobody of that name, he replied. I hesitated. Then I asked, did the gentleman who spent the night in room 175 depart alone? The reception clerk called the uniformed concierge, and asked, did number 175 leave alone? Yes, was the reply. He caught the early express for Zaragoza. He was going on to Barcelona, he told me. He went in the omnibus. No one with him. Nobody. When did he arrive? I asked. The night before last. He was alone with only a handbag. I charged him with a deposit for his room. Have you ever seen him before? I asked. Never to my recollection. Neither have I, remarked the concierge. He seemed very afraid of being seen. I noticed him in the lounge last night. He left this morning quite suddenly, and without taking anything, even a cup of coffee. He left in a violent hurry, eh? I exclaimed, well knowing the reason. Well, I added, I'll wish to see the manager. I will inform him, the clerk replied, and he went to the telephone. A minute later, after exchanging a few words in Spanish, he turned to me, saying, you will find the manager's office on the first floor. If you take the lift, the man will direct you, Sire. A few minutes later I was seated in the office of an elderly bald-headed man, a typical hotelier, courteous, smiling, and eager to hear any complaint that I might have to make. At once I told him of my curious adventure off previous night, and oft sudden flight of the mysterious stranger whom I had discovered in my room. That is certainly strange, sir, he replied in English. His excuse was a very ingenious one, to say the least. I think we ought to inform the police. Do you not agree? I told him of my discovery of the carpet pins, and asked his advice as to whom I might send them for chemical analysis. At once he suggested Professor Vega, of the Princesa Hospital in the Calle Alberto Aguilera, adding, the professor often dines here. If I wish, I will take you to him. So still leaving the 3 carpet pins upon the little glass tray, I wrapped it in paper and together we went round to the hospital, where I was introduced to a tall, narrow-faced, gray-haired man in a long linen coat. To him I explained how I had found the pins on the carpet beside my bed, and asking whether he would submit them to examination. He looked at them critically, first with a naked eye and afterwards by means of a large reading glass. Then he grunted in dissatisfaction and promised that next day, or the day after, he would tell me the result of his analysis. As we drove back to the hotel, the manager remarked, it is a very curious affair, sir, to say the least. One does not scatter carpet pins about a bedroom, and particularly when the points are smeared with some mysterious substance. If they had been there before you retired to bed, the chambermaid must certainly have seen them. She makes a round of the rooms each night at 10 o'clock. Besides, the facts that the bolt had been tampered with, and also that the man who occupied 175 left so early and so hurriedly, are additionally suspicious. Yes, he added, I'll think we ought to see the police. With that object he took me at once to Sihor Andrade, the chief of police, a short, stout, alert little man, who heard me with keen interest and seemed very puzzled. The intruder's explanation was certainly a very clever one, he remarked in French. It is a pity you did not demand to see his friend, Pedro Espada. If you had, you would have discovered him to be non-existent. But he was so clever, I answered. He told me that at that hour he could not discover in which room his friend was really sleeping, But the night porter was on duty, exclaimed the hotel manager. He had the register and would have been able at once to tell you the number of the room. The fellow seemed so frank in revealing to me his money, the portraits of his family, and his private letters, that I had taken his statement as the truth. Yet, even now, I could not believe that he had any sinister design, not until the professor had examined those 3 carpet pins. In response to close questions put to me by Sr. Andrade, with whom was Sr. Rivero, the head of the detective branch, I gave a description of my midnight visitor as accurately as I could. I told them how I had covered him with my automatic pistol, and how afterwards we had laughed together at our mental fear of each other. Sr. Rivero, the bald-headed, black-bearded chief of the branch of criminal investigation, suddenly stopped me when I mentioned the scar upon the neck of the advocate from Burgos. "Did you notice that there was any deformity of his hands?" he asked quickly. In an instant I recollected that the little finger of his right hand had been amputated at the first joint, and I told him so. "Ah!" exclaimed the shrewd, dark-bearded official. "Perhaps we may here find something of interest." Just a few moments, and he rose and left us. We chatted with Sr. Andrade for about a quarter of an hour when the detective returned with a bundle of papers and 4 photographs of a man taken in police style upon one negative, full face, diary quarter, half and profile. The instant he placed it before me, I exclaimed, "Why, that is Saliveri." "I thought as much," remarked the famous detective with a grim smile. "He is not Salivera, but Rodriguez Despojal, one of the most dangerous criminals in Spain." "Despojal," cried Sr. Andrade. "And he was in Madrid last night." Then he added, "Ah! If we had but known." "True. But why was he in the English gentleman's room?" queried the detective. "He is a dangerous character, and one would have thought that instead of being covered he would, on being cornered, have drawn his knife and attacked his adversary." "Despojal is no amateur," the chief of police agreed. "We've wanted him for the last 5 years for the assassination of the banker, Monteros, in the train between Cordova and Malaga, and yet he always evades us, even though he is one of the most audacious thieves in Europe." "But his friend Pedro?" I remarked, startled at what I had now learned. "He does not exist," replied the detective. "You no doubt had a lucky escape. Had you demanded to see his friend he would no doubt have killed you. He is a man of colossal strength, a veritable tiger, they say." "But what was the motive?" I asked. "I have no valuables, save my watch and tie-pin, and £50 in English money. Surely it was not worthwhile to kill me for that." "No. That's just it," replied the dark-eyed detective, whose chagrin was so apparent that Despojal had slipped through his fingers. "The game was not worth the candle. So he returned after proving to you his bona fides. And these bona fides he always carries in order to extricate himself from any ugly situation." "But the carpet pins?" asked the hotel manager. The director of the Spanish secret police shrugged his shoulders, and said, "Until Professor Vega can make a report we can do nothing. It is no use basing theories upon mere surmises. So we can only wait for Sr. Vega to tell us what he discovers. Meanwhile, we will fry and secure Despojal, though I fear he has too long a start of us." He crossed the room to the telephone, and a few minutes later spoke in Spanish into the instrument in sharp, authoritative tones. I understood him to be speaking to the police commissary at Zaragoza, explaining that the much-wanted criminal Despojal had left Madrid for that city, and giving the train by which he was supposed to be traveling. Then, in turn, he spoke to the commissaries of Alcázar, Salamanca, Valladolid, and Arroyo, thus informing the police along all the lines of railway leading from the capital. It was evident that what I had told them caused considerable excitement. Indeed, after the head of the detective department had concluded giving his instructions over the telephone, he turned to me and translated into French the black record of the stranger whom I had discovered in my room. That he was a bold and audacious criminal was quickly apparent. In the Sud Express traveling between Madrid and Paris he had drugged and robbed an Italian jeweler of a wallet containing a quantity of diamonds, which he took to London at once and disposed of to a receiver of stolen property at Kilburn. Another of his daring exploits was the theft of the famous Murillo from the castle of Set Phyllis, near Seville. This he sold to a dealer in Brussels, who afterwards smuggled it to New York, where it was bought by a private collector for a very large sum. Yet again, a few months later he enticed a bank messenger in Barcelona into a house he had taken for the purpose, and having knocked him down robbed him of his wallet containing a quantity of English banknotes and negotiable securities. Up to 5 years before he had been convicted many times, but he now seemed to be able to commit robberies with impunity, and always get off free. It was believed that he lived in secret somewhere abroad and only came to Spain to commit thefts. Probably he passed to and fro to France by one of the obscure mountain tracks through the Pyrenees known only to those who dealt in contraband, and there are many in that chain of mountains. In any case, the police were now hot again upon his track. Suddenly the head of the detective department had another inspiration and rang up both Jaca and Pamplona, which are at the end of each railway line towards the barrier of mountains which form the French frontier. If he is on his way to France he will go to either one place or the other, he said. But have they his photograph? I asked. A copy of this photograph taken at the prison of Barcelona is in every detective office in Spain, was his reply. Rodriguez Despujol is the most dangerous and elusive criminal at large, he went on. He never leaves anything to chance. No doubt he believed that you were in possession of something valuable, and his intention was to drug you and get it. But you were too quick for him. My chief surprise is why, when he found himself cornered as he was, that he did not draw his knife and attack you. But I had a pistol, I said. Despujol does not fear pistols. Before you could pull the trigger he could have pounced upon you like a cat, replied the police official. Well, he certainly entirely misled me, I exclaimed. I even offered him an apology for my attitude towards him. The three men laughed heartily. An apology to Despujol, cried the chief of police. How very amusing. I'll consider that I very lucky, I said. He seems to be a most desperate character. He is, answered Sihor Andrade. We have had inquiries for him from all over Europe. During the war it seems that he served as a spy of Germany in France, hence the military authorities there are very anxious to get him. But you think he lives in France and crosses the frontier every now and then? Yes. We received information to that effect about a year ago. He probably lives as a poor, but perfectly honest man in one of the remote villages in the Pyrenees, and is perhaps held in high esteem by all around him. It was the case of the notorious Maurice Tricochet, who escaped us for years and lived near Luchon until he was betrayed by a woman whose husband he had maltreated. Perhaps Despujol will also be betrayed. We hope so. I cannot understand why the fellow dared to put foot into Madrid when he knows how active we are in search of him, remarked Sihor Rivero, turning to me. He must have followed you with evil intent. The explanation of mistaking your room was, of course, a good one, but entirely false. I longed to tell the police all about the mystery of Stretton Street, and the grave suspicions concerning the great international financier who was at that moment at the Ritz. Yet I hesitated for two reasons, the first being that I feared lest my story should be disbelieved, and secondly, because I had, on behalf of the beautiful girl with whom I had fallen in love, set out to solve the enigma by myself, and bring the culprit to justice. If Despujol is arrested I will willingly come forward and give evidence, that is, if I am still in Spain, I promised. But both police officials shrugged their shoulders, and the detective remarked, Despujol is a will-o'-the-wisp. There seems little hope of our ever securing him. Nevertheless we shall continue to do our best to allow you to face him again one day. And then, Sapphire, you will realize what a miraculous escape you have had. Chapter the 17th. What the professor found. When I met my friend Hambledon in secret at 2 o'clock that day under the trees at a spot in the Retiro, not far from the great Plaza de la Independencia, we sat down and I described to him my strange midnight adventure. He listened in amazement, which was increased when I told him how the police had recognized in the inoffensive lawyer of Burgos the notorious bandit Despujol, who was wanted not only by Scotland Yard, but by the police of Europe. But those carpet pins are a curious feature of the affair, Hughie, he remarked. Yes. The police seem to attach no importance to them, but I do. So do I. The opinion of Professor Vega may throw some light upon the affair. I shall call at the Princessa Hospital tomorrow, I said, and then I inquired the latest information concerning de Gex and his French friend. There was little to report. De Gex had not been out of the hotel, though Suzier had gone to purchase some cigars at 11 o'clock that morning. While Suzier was absent, de Gex had, according to the friendly concierge, received a visitor, a middle-aged Spanish woman of the middle class. She had asked to see him, and on her name being sent up the Great One at once gave orders for her to be admitted. Again the floor waiter became inquisitive, and heard the financier speaking in English with his visitor. Unfortunate. Most unfortunate, he heard de Gex say. I am very glad, however, that you have come to me so quickly. You had a telegram from Siguenza, eh? I received it only a quarter of an hour ago, sir, the woman had replied in broken English. Then de Gex had apparently given her something for her services, and dismissed her. A telegram from Siguenza? I exclaimed, when my friend Harry had told me this. Now Siguenza is on the direct line from here to the Pyrenees and the French frontier. That telegram may be from Despujol while in flight. If so, the police have set a trap for him at his journey's end, either at Jaca beneath Montperdu, or at Pamplona. I wonder if he'll be caught. He might go on to Zaragoza and then turn to Barcelona and Marseilles. Hambledon remarked. All the frontiers are watched, so it seems almost impossible for him to escape. But, I added, I wonder if this information conveyed by the Spanish woman really concerned the fugitive. I wonder. A man like de Gex, with so many financial irons in the fire, and with agents in every European capital, is bound to receive visits from all sorts and conditions of people who bring him information for profit. When one deals in colossal sums as he does, one has to cultivate people of all classes, Hambledon said. Personally, I don't think the woman's information had anything to do with your mysterious friend's hurried departure, he added. Elle do. I'm highly suspicious. There was some motive that he did not attack me, as he could so easily have done, for he's a most desperate character and has committed several murders when cornered. His explanation was really wonderful, and I admit that I was so completely deceived that I actually apologized to him. But, I went on, we may perhaps know more when we learn the TNLTH from Professor Vega. Hence at noon next day I called at the great hospital in the Calle Alberto Aguilera, and was ushered into the professor's room. Ah, my dear monsieur, he exclaimed in French, knowing that I spoke Spanish only with the greatest difficulty. I'm very glad you have called. Those brass-headed pins which upholsterers often use, and which you have submitted to me, are most interesting from a toxicological point of view. What? I gasped. Were they poisoned? Undoubtedly, replied the grey-faced old expert. And by somebody who is au courant with the very latest and undetectable poison. I searched for alkaloids and glucosids, and used Kippenberger's process, and then the tests of Marne, Meyer, Skeblin, and Dragendorf. Since you brought the 3 pins to me I have been active all the time, for the problem much interests me. At last, though I did not think that the substance could possibly contain so subtle, deadly, and as yet unknown poison, I applied Sonnenschein's reagent phosphomolybdic acid, and then I obtained a result only an hour ago indeed. And what was the result, Professor? He looked me straight in the face, and replied, you have had a very narrow escape from death, monsieur, a very narrow one. Had you placed your foot upon one of those upturned points you would have fallen dead within 5 seconds. Why? Because each of the points of those 3 pins, left there as though by accident by some upholsterer employed by the hotel, was impregnated by one of the most deadly of all newly discovered poisons. It is called by men of my profession orosin, after its discoverer Orosi, and is certainly a most dangerous poison in the hands of anyone with criminal intent, because no post-mortem examination known to the medical profession today would be able to detect whether the victim had been murdered or died of natural causes. It astounds me. I gasped. No doubt. But to me, of course, it is a most interesting piece of research, and the professor went on, I have never met this substance before, though I had heard whispers of it. Professor Orosi, who lived in Cologne a few years ago and is now dead, produced this poison quite accidentally, and among his intimate friends disclosed its existence, though he had no idea how to test for it with certainty. For 5 years all toxicologists made constant tests until apparently quite by accident Professor Sonnenschein, of Hanover, discovered the reagent which would reveal the actual glucoside, and determine its identity. It gives a yellowish-white precipitate, he added, holding up for my inspection a small test tube containing a liquid of the color he had indicated. Marvelous! I exclaimed. Had no idea that medical science could carry inquiries so far. I know that in criminal cases in London our pathologists, with their mirror tests for arsenic, fix the guilt upon poisoners in a manner most amazing. But I have never heard of this secret and most subtle poison which was placed beside my bed, the intention being for me to tread upon the impregnated pin. And if you had done so you would have been taken with a sudden fatal seizure, the cause of which would never have been detected. You mean I should have died of poison? You certainly would. No medical aid would have been of any avail, for orosin is the most deadly substance which has ever been discovered. It is indeed good for humanity that it is known to only a few toxicologists, but that in itself reveals the fact, monsieur, that an exceedingly clever and secret attack has been made upon your life. A single puncture of the skin with one or other of those pins which were placed so conveniently at your bedside when you sprang out to meet the intruder, and you would by this time have been buried as one whose death had been due to natural causes. I held my breath. This declaration by one of the greatest professors of toxicology in Europe staggered me. A dastardly attempt had been made upon me by one of the most notorious of modern criminals. Why? No attempt at assassination is made without some motive, and the game must ever be worth the candle. The whole of the dramatic incidents of the night flashed across my memory, how I had faced the fellow in my room, challenged him at the point of my pistol, and compelled him to give me meekly proofs of his respectability. Truly it was all humorous but only from Despojol's point of view. I recollected those innocent-looking pins which apparently had been left so carelessly in my room. Each held for me a sudden and suspicious death. The slightest puncture of the skin would inevitably prove fatal, the professor continued. Feeling yourself pricked you would naturally remove the pin and very quickly afterwards death would supervene. So prior to it you yourself would no doubt have removed all trace of the crime. It is as well that such poison is not generally known, or it would be used by many who wish to get rid of their friends, I remarked. The professor laughed, and agreed, saying, there are several poisons of the same type which are known only to toxicologists, and we are very careful not to allow the public sufficient knowledge of them. I must confess that I never dreamed when I commenced my investigations that I was in the presence of orosin. There is sufficient in this little he held it to the light to kill 100 persons. It certainly is one of the most dangerous of known compounds. So it is evident that the man Despojol entered my room and placed the pins there intending that I should step upon one or other of them. I gasped. Without doubt. And it seems little short of a marvel that you escaped, said the professor. It certainly does, I remarked. But I must tell the police of the fact you have established. The affair now assumes a new phase. The man was not in my room with the intention of robbery, but in order to encompass my death by secret means. If you had not so fortunately avoided treading upon the pins you certainly would not be alive at the moment, remarked the professor, again reflectively examining the yellow fluid in the tube. What motive could the man have had in gaining access to your room and placing the pins there? I suppose he did not risk putting them there before you went to bed, as you might have picked one up on your boot, and that would have drawn your attention to them. By placing them there after you were in bed he hoped that, on getting out, your bare foot would come into contact with one of the impregnated points. It was certainly a most fiendish plot, I declared. And I thank you, Professor, for taking all this trouble with your analysis and so establishing the truth. I will go to the police and inform them. Yes. I wish you to do that, for the fellow is undoubtedly in possession of orosin, and intends to use it. Perhaps he has already killed people by the same subtle and secret means. He must be arrested at all costs, I said. Already the police all over Spain are watching for him, and special surveillance is being kept along all the railways and on the frontier. Any person with orosin in his possession should be detained and examined, the professor declared. I'll wonder where he obtained it. Who knows? I exclaimed, but I was reflecting whether, after all, my presence in Madrid was not known to de Gex. If so, was it possible that he had hired the notorious Despujol to attack me in secret? Of course we know that there is a secret traffic in poisons. Medical legists, with the police, have established that fact over and over again, said Professor Vega. But the vendors are very difficult to trace. One was found only 6 months ago, a doctor living in a suburb of Copenhagen. But Orosin is not known to a dozen people beyond those who study toxicology. Hence this man Despujol must have been supplied with it by someone who knew. The suspicion had arisen in my mind that de Gex and his agent Suzier knew that I was in Madrid for the purpose of watching them, and they had resorted to a very clever and secret means of getting rid of me once and for all. If the notorious criminal Despujol was in their pay, he would no doubt afterwards blackmail them, now that the desperate plot had failed. Again, could it be possible that Moroni had had any hand in supplying this most effective and dangerous of all secret poisons to the Spanish malefactor who snapped his defiant fingers under the very nose of the police? As I sat in that quiet room of the professor's, a room that smelled strongly of chemicals, though it was filled mostly with books, I could not refrain from shuddering when I reflected upon the narrow escape I had had. Yet if de Gex resorted to such measures, he must certainly hold me in great fear. Besides, if my life was threatened, so also was that of my friend Harry Hambledon, who remained so vigilant in the serene belief that his presence was undetected. At that time I never dreamed that the great financier who controlled the destinies of certain European states never moved without a police official being in attendance, and that surveillance was kept upon him as though he were royalty traveling incognito. De Gex, it seemed, was ever afraid that one of his enemies, the hundreds whom he had ruined by dint of sharp practice, unscrupulous dealing, and flagrant bribery, might seek revenge. Hence, though neither Hambledon nor myself knew of it, both de Gex and his toady and agent, Gaston Suzier, were well aware of our presence, and, moreover, were kept posted concerning our movements from day to day. Though we were in ignorance of all this, yet the desperate nature of the plot against me caused me to wonder what exactly was the fear in which de Gex held me. Of course it concerned Gabrielle Tennyson. But exactly how, I failed to surmise. One thing was certain, that the mystery man of Europe intended to rid himself of me, and in this he was being aided by certain of his friends, chief among whom were Suzier and Moroni. That the assassin Despujol was only a paid servant was quite clear. But the pay must have been a very handsome sum to cause him to dare to come to Madrid so boldly and run the risk of arrest. I smiled at my own innocence when I remembered how completely he had imposed upon me by showing me his papers of identity, and the photographs of his pretended family. Truly only a great criminal could have remained so imperturbed and polite to the man whom he intended should die. This drug Orosin is a very mysterious one, I suppose. I remarked a few seconds later as the professor, who had offered me a cigar, was in the act of lighting up. Yes. A very weak solution taken by the mouth produces extraordinary effects upon the human brain. The latter almost instantly becomes unbalanced and the victim lapses into an unconscious state for days, even for weeks, he said. Very often the brain is quite normal, save that a complete loss of memory follows the return to consciousness. In other cases Orosin has produced complete and hopeless dementia. Always hopeless? I asked eagerly, recollecting my own case and that of Gabrielle Tennyson. Not always hopeless. There have been cases that have been cured. Do you know any personally? I demanded breathlessly. There are one or two, very few on record. Professor Gerbale, the well-known alienist of Lyons, has observed 2 patients who recovered. But the majority of cases where Orosin has been administered were found incurable. The mind is blank, the memory completely destroyed, and the general health so undermined that only the strongest persons can withstand the strain. At once I described Gabrielle's symptoms and general attitude, whereupon the professor said, "What you tell me are the exact symptoms exhibited by a person to whom a small dose of Orosin has been administered. In most cases, however, such a state of mind develops into actual insanity with a homicidal tendency. Such a patient should be very carefully watched, for in 90% the chance 0 of a cure is, alas, Beyond expectation. Chapter the 18th. More about the mystery man. One very important fact I had established. Orosin was the obscure and little-known drug that had been administered to Gabrielle Tennyson, as well as to myself, by the mystery man of Europe at his palatial house in Stretton Street. Gabrielle, being the weaker, was still suffering from its paralyzing effects, while L, the stronger, had practically recovered. Yet it had been intended by the daring Despojal that a fatal accident should now befall me. And could anything be plainer than that the fellow for whom the police were searching so eagerly was a hireling of the man de Gex who went in fear of me? That most secret and most potent of all poisons might be known to Moroni. Indeed, it apparently was known to him, and the endeavor had been to introduce it into my system by means of an infected carpet pin. On leaving Professor Vega, I at once sent a note round to Hambledon, and awaited his arrival. When he came, I related all the professor had told me. "Well, Hugh," he said, "we now know the TMTH, and it remains for us to combat the fiends. If you are marked down, no doubt I am also. So it behoves us both to be very wary. Why can't we tell the police the whole circumstances?" I suggested. "My dear fellow, they wouldn't believe you, and they wouldn't arrest such a powerful man as Oswald de Gex," was his serious reply. "Money can buy immunity from arrest in every country in Europe, and especially de Gex's money, for it can be distributed in secret by his agents. No. If we are to be successful, we must lay our plans just as cleverly as he lays his. We must allow him to believe that we are entirely unsuspicious of his plotting. That is our only way." I realized that there was much youth in his argument. It remained with us to pretend ignorance. Therefore we resolved to still watch and wait. A few hours later I told Sihor Andrade, the chief of police, of the professor's discovery that the points of the pins had been infected with orosin, the newly discovered drug which in small doses produced loss of memory and insanity, and in larger doses sudden death. In reply, he informed me that though every effort had been made to trace the elusive fugitive, all had been in vain, and that he was still at large. "But if he has this terrible drug in his possession, he is more than ever a danger to society," the Spanish official went on, speaking in French. "Thank you, monsieur, for all the information you have given me, and you may rely upon me to take every possible step towards securing his arrest. I was in telegraphic communication with the Paris Steward only this morning concerning him. I will wire them again. They have been stirred into activity by the message I sent them after your call to see me." I longed again to be frank with the affable Sihor Andrade, yet I saw that if I were I might negative all chance of solving the problem which concerned the health and life of the girl whom I had grown to love so fervently. Upon a sudden impulse I remarked with affected carelessness, "I'll hear that our English financier, Mr. de Gex, is at the Ritz." "Yes," he replied. "He is here under an assumed name in connection with some big railway scheme in Estremadura, a line between Toledo and Merida. It is badly wanted, and has been talked of for years. There is a huge stretch of country south of the Tagus as far as Villanueva without any railway communication. The king himself has been agitating for the development of that rich agricultural region for the last 10 years. And now it seems as though your great financier, Monsieur de Gex, is here to consult with the Ministry of Communications." "Yes," I said, realizing in what high esteem that mystery man of millions was held. "I do not think I would care to have such colossal wealth as his," remarked the chief of police. "As soon as he arrived from Paris I had orders from the ministry to place him under surveillance, because, it seems, he goes in fear of some personal attack upon him." "By whom?" I asked, instantly interested. "The information is vague," was his reply. Then, taking up a large yellow paper from his desk, he said, "It seems that he has applied to the ministry for personal protection, and for a daily report of anyone who may be keeping observation upon him. There is a young Englishman living at the Palace Hotel who seems unduly interested in a gentleman's movements. We are watching him." I held my breath. This vast and unexpected revelation. De Gex was in fear of us, and had resorted to that ruse in order to keep himself posted upon Hambledon's movements. Truly the situation was daily growing more complicated. Surely such a well-known man as Mr. de Gex, a man who is noted not only for his immense wealth, but for his generous contributions to charity could not have enemies. I remarked. Everyone has enemies, my dear Monsieur, was the police official's suave reply. Señor de Gex was here in Madrid a year ago when he made a similar application to the Ministry for Personal Surveillance. He was here in connection with the foundation of the new Madrid and Southern Spain Banking Corporation, which is guaranteed by a group of French and Dutch financiers of whom Señor de Gex is the head. He paused, and then continued, he seems highly strong and nervous. All men who are in the public eye seem to be the same. Well-known foreigners visiting Madrid often apply for surveillance, yet there is certainly no need of it. And I confess to you that my staff is, after all, unduly worked. I can quite imagine that, I said. But is a strict watch kept upon Mr. de Gex? Yes, and upon his agent, Monsieur Souzier, also. Has Monsieur Souzier been in Madrid before? He was here 2 years ago when Señor de Gex had some big financial deal with the Count Camardin, who was head of the Miramar Shipping Company of Barcelona. They say he bought the whole fleet of steamers from Count C. Camardin. Was Count Camardin wealthy? Yes. A millionaire, without a doubt. But it is said that shortly before his death he quarreled with his wife. Why, nobody knows. She lives at Segovia, and their house here in the capital has just been sold. Was any attempt made upon Mr. de Gex? I asked. Well, a mysterious young Frenchman called one night at the Ritz and demanded to see him. He was very excited, and when he was refused admission upstairs, he flourished a revolver. My agent on duty arrested the stranger, who was, after examination, deported. For that Señor de Gex sent me a letter of thanks, and the scarf pin which you see I wear. The pin he indicated consisted of a single black pearl with a base surrounded by diamonds, an expensive piece of jewelry. That, in itself, was sufficient to show that Oswald de Gex was a past master in the art of bribery, and that he had established in the minds of the authorities of the Spanish capital that when he came there he came in the interests of the government, and hence he could do no wrong. Ah! How I longed to be able to tell my story to that charming official. But I saw that if I did so he would not only disbelieve me, but put me down as an exaggerating fool. So I held my tongue. I further questioned him concerning de Gex and his friend Souzier. Monsieur Souzier has been in Madrid before, he said. He is agent of Señor de Gex. But how wealthy the latter must be. During the war he made a big loan to our government. The real extent of it is not known, but some say that he can pull the strings of the cabinet in any way he wishes, though the king disapproved of the whole transaction. At least that is the rumor. Yet, after all, Señor de Gex is a UUE friend of Spain, even though he, like all financiers, obtains huge percentages upon his loans. True, I laughed. Men of wealth are seldom philanthropists. One finds more tunnel philanthropy among the poor, and in the artistic circles of Lower Bohemia, than in the circles of the ultra-rich. Philanthropy is not emptied in the dictionary of the war-rich, those blatant profiteers with their motors and their places in the country, who, having fattened upon the lives of the brave fellows who fought and died to save Europe from the unholy Hun, are now enjoying their lives, while the widows and orphans of heroes starve. All, Monsieur Garfield, with that I entirely agree, sighed the astute man seated at his writing table with the 3 telephones at his elbow. In my official career as head of the police department of Madrid, I have watched recent events, and I have seen how men who were little removed from the category of the worst criminals, have suddenly jumped into wealth, with its consequent notoriety, and the power which is inseparable from the possessor of money. The international financier Oswald de Gex is one of those, I said. You cannot close your eyes to that fact. You appear to entertain some antipathy towards him, he remarked, a little surprised it seemed. No, not at all, I assured him, smiling. I only speak broadly. All these great financiers fatten upon the ruin of honest folk. I hardly think that such is the case with Señor de Gex, he remarked. But you are English, and you probably know more than myself concerning his career? Nobody in England knows much about him, was my reply. We only know that he is immensely wealthy, and that his riches are daily increased by the various ventures which he finances. He is a great support to our Ministry of Finance, declared the chief of police. It was Count Camardin V7 who first interested him in Spain, I believe. In any case, they combined to finance a number of industrial enterprises, including the great Guadajas copper mine, which must, in itself, have brought them both a fortune. You said that the Count is dead, I remarked. Yes. He died quite suddenly last year. He was one of the most popular men at court, and his tragic death caused a great sensation. He was taken ill in the Sud Express while traveling from Madrid to keep an appointment with Sihor de Gex in Paris, and though he was taken from the train on its arrival at San Sebastian and conveyed to the hospital, he died a few moments after reaching there. He had a weak heart, and had consulted 2 doctors only a month previously. They had ordered him a complete rest and change, but, contrary to their advice, he continued attending to his affairs with fatal result. And the Countess? All. Poor lady, she was beside herself with grief. She was his second wife. His first was the daughter of an Englishman who lived in Madrid. The present Countess is the daughter of the Marquis of Alanasa of Algeciras, and they were a most devoted pair. She now lives in Segovia in comparative seclusion. The Count's untimely end was a great loss to Spain. It was news to me that Oswald de Gex was in Madrid with his agent Suzier in connection with a new railway scheme. Indeed, what I had just been told was all amazing, and showed de Gex to be a man of outstanding genius. The mystery man of Europe took good care to inform himself of any person who watched his movements, or sought to inquire into his business. It certainly was a masterstroke to pretend fear of assassination, and compel the police to act as his personal guard. By that means he had learned that Hambledon and myself were in Madrid on purpose to discover what we could, hence he had hired the assassin Despojol to set that dastardly trap for me. Again it was upon the tip of my tongue to reveal the suspicions I had of the great financier, but I refrained, because I could see that my companion held de Gex in high esteem as a friend and financial mainstay of his country. A few moments later I reverted to the possibility of the arrest of Despojol, for if arrested he might betray de Gex as the person who had paid him to place those infected pins in my room. In such case my story would be heard and investigated. But the chief of police shook his head dubiously. I fear that he has again gone into safe hiding up in the mountains somewhere, without a doubt, he replied. It was an act of considerable daring to come boldly to Madrid and stay at your hotel when he knows full well the hue and cry for him is raised everywhere, and that there is actually 10,000 pesetas offered as reward for his capture. Someone may betray him, I suggested with a smile. Yes. We hope so. One of his friends, male or female, will no doubt do so and come one day to us for the reward. Not till then shall we know the truth of that strange attempt upon your life. The motive could not have been robbery, as you had nothing worth taking save your watch. If he had been found in de Gex's room at the Ritz one could have understood it. I smiled. The chief of police never suspected the true facts of the case, facts within my own knowledge, which were of such an amazing and startling character that I hesitated to relate them. When I left my friend I again sought Hambledon and told him all I had learned. He grunted. Very wily of de Gex to get the police to keep an eye upon me. If I'm not careful I shall suddenly find myself under arrest as a suspicious person who is in the habit of loitering in the vicinity of the great financier. Yes, I agreed. This seems to put an end to our present activity, does it not? Well, he apparently knows that we are watching, Hambledon said. What a pity we cannot tell the police all we know. If we did we should not be believed, and, moreover, they wouldn't hear a word against the great man who is such a friend to Spain. Money buys reputation, remember. Nobody knows that better than de Gex. Hambledon was standing at my bedroom window looking thoughtfully down upon the Puerta del Sol with its crowd of hurrying foot passengers. It seems a miserable ending to all our careful surveillance upon Suzier, doesn't it? He grumbled. True, it does. But now that the pair are on the alert I cannot see that anything can be gained by remaining in Madrid longer, I pointed out. Then you intend to give up the quest for the TMTH? Not by any means, I replied quickly. I intend, at all hazards, and at all costs, to still fathom the mystery. What we have learned since we came to Spain puts quite a different complexion upon matters. We are now in possession of certain facts concerning de Gex, facts of which we had no suspicion. We had never dreamed that to further his ends he did not hesitate to employ a notorious criminal to commit murder with malice aforethought. Neither did we know anything of his financial dealings with the Spanish Ministry of Finance, or his partnership with the Conde de Camardin, or that the drug he used upon poor Gabrielle and myself was the obscure but most deadly and dangerous orosin. All these are points which may in the near future be of greatest advantage to us. Therefore we must not despair. Let us take courage and continue to probe the mystery for the sake of poor Gabrielle Tennyson, I urged. Let us act as quietly and discreetly as our enemy is acting, and we may yet attain success. Chapter the 19th. The track of Despojol. Having decided to still remain in Madrid, I deemed it advisable to engage the services of a private inquiry agent to watch the movements of de Gex and Susie who still remained at the Ritz. The mystery man, living under an assumed name, never went out in the daytime, though Susie often went forth, paying visits to certain banks and commercial offices in connection with the proposed new railway. The man we engaged was an elderly ex-detective of the Seville police, named Pardo, who very soon discovered the identity of the secret agent employed to keep surveillance upon de Gex on behalf of the police so that no harm should befall him. In consequence, I took Pardo into my confidence, and calling him to my hotel, explained that I desired to keep secret watch upon the Frenchman Susie without the knowledge of the detective watching de Gex. L particularly desired to know the addresses of any telegram which Susie may send. Probably he may send some message to Italy. If so, please discover the address and the text of the message. I believe that de Gex might communicate with Moroni, now that the plot of Despojol had failed. I will watch, Señor, was the grey-haired Spaniard's reply. If Señor Susie sends any telegram, I shall probably obtain a copy of it. They know me well at the chief telegraph office. Señor Susie appears to be transacting a considerable amount of business in Madrid, a scheme for a new railway, I understand. Yes, I know. All I want you to do is to find out who visits Mr. de Gex, and whether any telegrams are sent by either him or Mr. Susie. I quite understand, Sapphire, was the detective's reply as he rose, and a few minutes later withdrew. Late in the evening 2 days afterwards I returned to the hotel to find the man Pardo awaiting me. After I had taken him up to my room and closed the door, he drew a piece of paper from his pocket, saying in French, Señor Susie sent a telegram at 8:30 this evening, of which this is a copy. The message he handed me was in a penciled scribble, and was in English as follows: Charles Rebel, Rue de Lalande 163, Montauban. Important that I should see you. Meet me at Hotel Luxembourg, Nîmes, without fail, next Monday at noon. O. The initial O stood for Oswald de Gex. So the mystery man of Europe contemplated leaving Madrid. I thanked the man Pardo, who said, Señor Susie did not dispatch the telegram from the chief office in the Calle del Correo, but from the branch office in the Plaza del Progreso. He apparently wished to send it in secret. I wonder why? I asked. The Spaniard raised his shoulders. The address conveyed nothing to me. But the message was proof that de Gex intended to leave Spain, and further, it was a source of satisfaction to know his destination in case he slipped away suddenly. After Pardo had gone, I sat and pondered. It struck me as very curious that Susie should have gone to a distant telegraph office in order to send a message. It seemed that he feared to be recognized by the counter-clerk at the chief telegraph office. For over an hour I smoked reflectively. I confess that a curious ill-defined suspicion had arisen in my mind, a suspicion that became so strong that just about 11 o'clock I entered the Jefatura Superior de Policia in the Calle de la Princesa, and again inquired for Señor Andrade. Fortunately he had been detained in his office, and I was shown into his presence. He seemed surprised to see me, but at once he became interested when I said, I have a distinct suspicion that I know the whereabouts of Despojol. Have you? He exclaimed quickly. What causes you to suspect? A man whom I believe to be an acquaintance of his has today sent an urgent telegram to Charles Rebel, Rue de Lalande, 163, in Montauban, in France, making an appointment to meet him at the Hotel Luxembourg at Nîmes next Monday at noon. Who is his friend? He asked eagerly. I regret, Sr. Andrade, that I am not in a position to answer that question. The whole matter is only one of suspicion, very strong suspicion. The chief of police looked very straight at me. All. Then you are in possession of certain secret knowledge concerning the man who made such a dastardly attempt upon your life, he remarked. And you suspect this Charles Rabel at Montauban to be the fugitive, eh? Exactly, I replied. He asked me to repeat the address, he scribbled down, and then looking up, said, personally, Sr. Garfield, I think your suspicions are unfounded. Despujol, if he is ever found, will be discovered in hiding somewhere in the mountains of the north. But why not in Montauban? I asked. He is apparently a well-educated man, judging from his conversation with me. He speaks French well, and perhaps passes as a French subject. He could pass for a Spaniard, an Italian, a Greek, or a Frenchman, Andrade remarked. And as forged passports are so cheap nowadays, and almost impossible to detect, the means of escape of such a daring criminal are both numerous and easy. But, he added, I am interested in this person whom you believe to be a friend of the fugitive. Cannot you tell me who he is? I shook my head, and smiling replied, I have only come here to tell you of a very distinct suspicion I entertain that Despujol is at Montauban. Then his friend is your enemy L, he suggested, his dark, penetrating eyes fixed upon mine. You know the motive of that trap which Despujol set for you, and yet you will not reveal it to me? Again I shook my head and smiled. It would make my task much easier, he remarked. I am aware of that. But at present mine is only a suspicion. I have no actual knowledge that Charles Rabel is the man you are so desirous of arresting. And you really refuse to tell me who sent this message, he asked in a tone of disappointment. It was sent in secret, I answered. Indeed, it was that fact which caused me to suspect. You can, of course, obtain the original of the telegram by applying for it from the authorities. But it is only signed by an initial. How did you obtain knowledge of it? Again, I have no intention of disclosing the source of my information, Sr. Andrade, I replied as politely as I could. I am, as a matter of fact, here in Madrid attempting to solve a very remarkable mystery which occurred in London a few months ago. This is most interesting. You never told me that before, he exclaimed. I confess I wondered with what motive you and your friend Sr. Hambledon, living at separate hotels, had in remaining here. It was regarded as suspicious by the detective force that being such intimate friends you lived at separate hotels, and met only in secret. Reports have reached me of your movements, and of your meetings, he laughed. More than once you have been regarded as suspected persons, he added. Well, I hope you do not regard me as a suspected person any longer, Sr. Andrade. I exclaimed with a smile. No, no, he laughed. But I confess you are something of a mystery. Why should the notorious Despujol dare to put his foot into Madrid and lay that deadly plot to kill you? You know the motive, and yet you will not disclose. Not at present, I said. If it is found that Charles Rabel is really Despujol, then I will come forward and state all that I know. You promise that? I do. Very well, then I will give orders to have your suspicions investigated, replied the patient, urbane official. A detective shall leave by the next train for Montauban with a request to the prefect of police of the department of Tarn-et-Tigaron for the arrest of the individual in question, if he should be identified. Then I will accompany him, I said. Excellent, he exclaimed. It would be well if Sr. Rivero, the head of the detective department, whom you have met, went in person to France. I will ring him up at his house. He took up the telephone and a few minutes later spoke rapidly in Spanish to the chief detective of Spain. Presently after a rapid conversation he put down the receiver, and said, Sr. Rivero will meet you at the Delicias station at 2 o'clock tomorrow morning. The express for Barcelona leaves at 2:15. From Barcelona you can get direct to Nîmes, and on to Montauban. And, head, I only hope you will be successful in arresting the notorious Despujol. I thanked him, and suggested that if we should be fortunate enough to identify him, we should watch for the keeping of the appointment at the Hotel Luxembourg at Nîmes on the following Monday. "With whom is he keeping the appointment?" asked Señor Andrade. "That I will disclose later," was my reply. "I know that the appointment has been fixed, and if we watch, we shall, I feel assured, gain some knowledge of considerable interest." "As you wish," replied the chief of police, who now seemed convinced by my manner that I was in possession of certain actual facts. "You will meet Senhor Rivero at—" "Certainly," I said. "Then I wish the pair of you the good fortune of arresting the assassin Despojol," he said as we shook hands and parted. I drove at once to Hambledon's hotel, where I found that he had just retired to bed. As he stood in his pajamas, surprised at my unexpected visit at that hour, I told him what I had arranged. "Then I will remain here and watch de Gex's departure," he said. "Yes. But be very careful of yourself," I urged. "Keep your revolver handy, for you never know when an attack may be made upon you. These fellows, though great men in the eyes of the world, employ desperate characters to do their dirty work." "I'm quite alive to that fact, Hugh," replied my friend. "But we won't give up till we punish those responsible for poor Miss Tennyson's state, will we?" "No, we won't," I declared determinedly. "Of course we may be on a scent, but something seems to tell me that we are pretty hot on the trail. The assassin Despojol would never have been employed by them if they did not hold us in dread." "Your journey to Montauban will prove whether you are right, Hugh," he said, and then, after arranging that he should follow Susie or should de Gex leave without him, and that he should at once wire me word to the poste restante at Nîmes, I left, and returning to the hotel packed my suitcase and later met the bald-headed but famous detective. The latter proved an amusing companion who, during the long night journey to the Mediterranean, recounted to me many of his interesting experiences. His French was better than his English, so we conversed in the former tongue. There was no sleeping carriage upon the train, therefore, after my companion had spoken to the conductor, we made ourselves as comfortable as we could in the first-class compartment which had been reserved for us. At 3:30 in the morning, with Spanish forethought, he produced some sandwiches, fresh fruit, and a bottle of excellent wine, upon which we made a hearty meal, after which we dozed in our corners till dawn. Throughout the day my companion, who was quite as eager as myself to arrest the notorious Despojol, chatted in French as we went slowly down the fertile valley of the Ebro and suddenly out to where on our right lay the broad blue sea. Not until late afternoon did we arrive at Barcelona, and having 2 hours to wait we went along the Paseo de San Juan to the Francia station, and having deposited our bags there, strolled along to the Plaza de Catalunya, where, at the Gay Maison Dorée, we had coffee and cigarettes, while my companion read the Diarto and I watched the picturesque crowd about us. Rivero knew Barcelona well, so after we had finished our cigarettes we took a taxi to the Central Police Office, where we had a chat with the chief of the detective department, a short stout little man with a round boyish face and a black mustache. After that we took another taxi along to the toy fair in the Plaza de la Constitución 6N, it being the feast of St. George, the patron saint of Catalonia, which accounted for the bustle and gaiety of the city. Then, after an interesting half-hour, we returned to the station and set out upon our slow 8-hour journey rough the rich winelands of Catalonia, with their quaint medieval villages and towns, with occasional glimpses off Sapphire Sea, and passing over many ravines and gullies we at last, long after nightfall, entered a long tunnel at the end of which vast the station of Port-Boo, the French frontier. The usual prying douaniers were quickly at work, and after some coffee at the Restaurant Baqui, which is so well known to travelers to southern Spain, we re-entered the train for Narbonne, where in the morning we changed and traveled to Montauban, by way of Carcassonne and Toulouse. It was late in the afternoon when, on arrival at our destination, we took rooms at the Hôtel du Midi on the opposite side of the Tarn to the prosperous pleasant little French town, once a headquarter of the Inquisition, and even now containing in its museum the executioner's axe and many instruments of torture. After a wash and a meal, for we were both very hungry, we set out to find Monsieur Charles Rabel, whose address was Rue de Lalande, number 163. We crossed the wonderful old brick bridge from Villebourbon to the town, a bridge built in the 14th century with an internal passage running beneath the roadway to the ancient chateau. Then, making our way past the old church of Saint Jacques, with its fine Gothic octagonal tower, and passing through a number of streets we found ourselves in the narrow old-world Rue de Lalande. Just as we entered the street, which contained a number of small shops, I halted. "He must not see me," I exclaimed. "I quite agree," replied the Spanish detective. "There is a little cafe over there. Go in and wait for me. I will make some discreet inquiries concerning this Monsieur Rebel." Hence we parted, and while Senhor Rivero sauntered along the street in search of the house in question, I went into the cafe and ordered a bock. Full of anxiety lest, after all, this man Rebel should be a respectable citizen, I waited. Time passed slowly. Half an hour went by. I ordered a mazagran and sat smoking, trying to suppress my eagerness. An hour elapsed, an hour and a half, 2 hours. I waited yet another half hour until the proprietor of the cafe began to look askance at me. Then I paid, and rising, went out into the street. It was now dark. There was no sign of my friend the Spanish police agent. He had disappeared. I stood upon the pavement full of anxiety and bewilderment. What could have happened to him? Chapter the 20th. Mademoiselle Jacquelot. I returned to my rather barely furnished room at the Hotel du Midi, which overlooked the place outside the station in the suburb across the river, and sank into a chair to reflect. The concierge, the lad who wore the concierge's cap, the concierge being off duty at his evening meal, informed me that my friend had not returned. He seemed an alert French lad of that type so frequently seen in continental hotels. Senhor Rivero had disappeared. For an hour I waited seated alone in my room, reflecting deeply. My sole desire and fixed object was to solve the enigma of Gabrielle Tennyson's unfortunate mental state and to bring to justice those unscrupulous blackguards responsible for it. As I sat there, her pale beautiful face arose before me, the wonderful countenance of the girl who had, in such a strange and indescribable manner, taken possession of my soul. To analyze my feelings towards her was impossible. I put to myself the query why I loved her, but I was utterly unable to answer it. I loved her most passionately and devotedly. That was all. The tragedy of the situation was that I loved one who, alas, could not return my affection as a girl with her mental balance unaffected could do. Her poor unbalanced brain could never allow her to understand me, or to return my love. I was tired after the long sleepless journey from Spain, and I suppose I must have dozed in my chair. I awoke suddenly, hearing a tap upon the door, and an elderly chambermaid entered with a telegram. I tore it open and found it had been dispatched from Castel Sarrazin, and was from Rivero, saying, "Absence unavoidable. Hope to be back by midnight." "Where is Castel Sarrazin?" I inquired of the woman. "It is about 16 kilometers from here, monsieur," replied the buxom woman in a strong accent of Toulouse. "It is on the road to Agen and the railway junction for Beaumont-de-Lomagne. Just a small town. They say that the name is a corruption of Castel Sarrazin. At least my mother used to tell me what, I wondered, had taken the head of the Madrid detective force out there. He must be following some fresh clue. So I went forth across the bridge to a big cafe opposite the theater, and there idled till nearly midnight, when I returned eagerly to meet my friend. He entered my room just before 1 o'clock in the morning, tired and dusty, for he appeared to have walked a long distance. I had some cognac and a siphon of seltzer awaiting him, and sinking exhausted into a chair, he took a long and refreshing drink before he spoke. "Well," he said with a sigh, "you have been wondering why I disappeared so mysteriously, L? The fact is I was compelled. On making inquiry of a shoemaker who has a little shop near Charles Rebel's house, I learned that the man for whom we are searching lived in a flat on the first floor of the house kept by a widow named Caliot. But he was frequently absent in England or in Italy. Only for short spells was he there, for he was a commercial traveler representing a Lyons firm of silk weavers." As we were speaking, the shoemaker pointed to a rather smart young woman who was at that moment leaving the house, and said, "Look. That is Mademoiselle Jacquelot, the fiancée of Monsieur Charles. She might tell you where he is. I do not think he is at home today. I saw him 4 days ago and spoke to him as he passed. But I believe he has left again." I thanked him, and at once followed Mademoiselle, Hence I had no time to tell you, for I had no idea where she was going. I saw that by following Rebel's fiancé I might gain some useful knowledge. She walked to the station, and took a ticket for Castel Sarrazin. I did the same. We had half an hour to wait, but I spent it patiently, and when we left I traveled alone with her in the same compartment. Soon I managed to get into conversation with her, whereupon I mentioned that I had a friend, Monsieur Charles Rebel, in Montauban, and that we had met in Paris. He had once shown me her photograph and I believed I was not mistaken that she was Mademoiselle Jacquelot. At first she was surprised, but I told her a very plausible story, whereupon she explained that Charles had gone to Toulouse on business 3 days before, but that he was returning at noon tomorrow. She herself lived in Castel Sarrazin. But do you anticipate that we shall discover in Charles Rebel the notorious Despojol? I inquired eagerly. Rivero raised his shoulders and elevated his black eyebrows, saying, "From facts I gathered from Mademoiselle concerning him I certainly think that we are really upon his track. It hardly seems possible, but we must remain in patience till tomorrow. Then, if we find our surmise correct, we must act with the greatest caution if we are to watch him to Nîmes where he is to meet your mysterious friend, the man whose name you refuse to reveal. When they meet you will at once recognize him," I said. "May be mistaken," I added. "But I do not anticipate that I am. If all goes well, then you will arrest a notorious Despojol." "I'll only wish that the fellow would fall into my hands," replied my companion. "If so, then revelations will be made that will startle Europe, and incidentally gain you promotion in the service L." I laughed. He nodded and admitted, "I hope so, Sr. Garfield." "I sincerely hope so," he replied, and we parted for the night. Next day I woke early and sought my friend. We idled about till nearly noon, when we went together to the railway station to watch the arrival of the train from Toulouse. A number of people were about, for the dusty lumbering express from Bordeaux to Marseilles had, at that moment, arrived, and considerable bustle ensued in consequence. While we stood watching the crowd, Sr. Rivero suddenly touched my arm, and whispered, "Look yonder. The girl in dark blue. That is Mademoiselle Jacquelot. She must not see me. I wonder why she is here if not to warn him of the inquiries made concerning him by a stranger." I glanced in the direction he had indicated and saw a tall, slim, rather good-looking girl sauntering idly in our direction. Her attention had, for the moment, been diverted by an advertisement upon the wall. "Quick!" cried my friend. "Let us slip back here." And next moment we had repassed the barrier, back into the booking office. "If she sees me her suspicions will be aroused if they are not already aroused," said my companion. "The fact that she is here gives rise to the question whether she is really so innocent as she pretends. She may know of her lover's escapades, and suspects me of having followed her out to her home. If she does suspect, then she is cleverer than you anticipated," I remarked. "Yes. But in any case we had better act independently. You return to the platform, for she has never seen you. You will remain well concealed and watch them meet, while I shall be at the exit to identify him if you find that you cannot get near enough to him without courting observation." As he spoke the bell was clanging, and there came the roar of the engine entering the big echoing station. I slipped back instantly upon the platform and standing at a point against the corner of the book stand where I hoped to escape unobserved, I turned my head away as the train came along. Then, when it drew up, I held my breath anxiously as I turned around. The girl in navy blue was not far from me searching along the train until, of a sudden, she espied a man in a dark overcoat and dark green velour hat, who had just alighted, carrying in his hand a small leather case. His countenance was ruddy, and he had a small black mustache. My heart fell. The man was a stranger to me. The countenance was not that of the man whom I had surprised in my bedroom at Madrid. He bent and greeted her affectionately, but next moment it was apparent that she was explaining something which caused his countenance to grow serious. He put 1 or 2 swift questions to her. Then halting suddenly, he glanced at his watch. I strove to get sufficiently near to look well into his face, but I feared recognition. Would he pass out of the exit where the famous Spanish detective was awaiting him? Rivero knew Despojol by photographs, and indeed had been present when he had been convicted on the last occasion a few years before. Mademoiselle's friend hesitated for some moments, and then accosting a porter asked a question. The man pointed to a train on the opposite platform. Was it possible that what Mademoiselle had told him had scared him? It seemed so, for with a sudden resolve, instead of walking to the exit he entered the booking office and bought another ticket. In an instant I dashed to the exit where the Spaniard was waiting, and in a few breathless words told him of the man's intention. To my amazement Senhor Rivero heard me unmoved. "I was awaiting you," he said. "The man you have been watching is not Despojol at all." Despojol, whom I recognized, passed out a few moments ago and took a cab to his house in the Rue de Lalande. "Then you have seen him?" I gasped. "Yes. It is Rodriguez Despojol, without a doubt, Monsieur Garfield. You have not been mistaken, and we must certainly thank you for putting us upon the track of this dangerous assassin. Then, after all, my surmise is correct. And he will go on Monday to meet his paymaster in Nîmes," I said. "The plot against me failed. Probably a second attempt is to be made. We shall be careful not to be seen until he travels to Nîmes," laughed Rivero, well satisfied at the progress he had made. "But I wonder who is the red-faced man whom Mademoiselle has met," I remarked. "She has evidently warned him of some danger." "If that's so we ought to see him," my friend exclaimed. "Let us go together onto the platform and watch. So long as Mademoiselle does not recognize me, we are safe." With a reassuring knowledge that the man who was being sought for by the whole police of Europe had gone to his unsuspicious abode in the Rue de Lalande, we returned to the far platform where a train stood waiting to leave. It was the Rapide for Paris by way of Bourges. The man was already in a third-class compartment, and as he stood with his head out of the window, Mademoiselle was chatting with him. Truly his stay in Montauban had not been long. The instant Rivero caught sight of the fellow's face, he exclaimed, "Holy Madonna! N.Vhy, it is Mateo Sanz, the motor bandit. We've been searching everywhere for him. He shot and killed a carabiner near Malaga a month ago. Next second he had left me and a few moments later hurried back. He had bought a ticket. Sanz does not know me. As soon as we left the station and are away from Mademoiselle I shall be all right. Remain here. I will wire you, and in any case we shall be together in Nîmes on Monday. But be careful not to be seen by Despojol. He is a wary bird, remember." Then, unseen by Mademoiselle, he entered a first-class compartment of the train, just as the signal was given to start. The train moved off, and I was left alone. Surely much had happened in those few exciting moments. But why had Mademoiselle Jacques warned her friend the motor bandit? If she had warned him because of Rivero's inquiries concerning Despojol, then she could also warn the latter. Again, it was curious that she met Sanz and did not meet Despojol. Further, it was a strange fact that the pair of Spanish criminals had not traveled together unless there was some reason for it. Perhaps there was. I watched Mademoiselle as she passed out off station to a little restaurant where she had a frugal meal. Then she returned and took a ticket back to her home in Castelsarrasin. Rivero now had his hands full. Not only had he identified in the respectable commercial traveler, Charles Rabel, the notorious assassin Despojol, but he had also quite accidentally come across Sanz the motor bandit, who of late had terrorized the south of Spain, and whose daring depredations were upon everyone's lips. Mademoiselle seemed to be a friend of both men. I returned to my hotel close by, and ate my déjeuner alone. My position was a very unenviable one, for I feared to go over into the town lest I should come face to face with a man who had so cunningly made an attempt upon me as the hireling of Oswald de Gex. But my thoughts were ever of my beloved, the girl who was the victim of some foul plot into which too, had been drawn, a mystery which I was devoting my whole life to solve. At 5 o'clock that evening I received a telegram from Harry in Madrid, telling me that all was quiet, and our friend, meaning de Gex, never went out. To this I replied in a cryptic way that our suspicions had been verified, and that the person of whom we were in search we had discovered. We were only now waiting for the appointment to be kept at the Hotel de Luxembourg at Nîmes. Next day passed uneventfully. In order to kill time I took train to the quaint little town of Moissac, an ancient little place on the Tarn about 25 kilometers distant, and there spent the hours wandering about the countryside which is so famed for its grapes in autumn. I did not return to Montauban till after 7, and while I sat at dinner the waiter handed me another telegram. It was from Rivero, and having been sent from Lyons, read, "All well. Just returning to Montauban." Later, I busied myself with timetables and found that he would be due to arrive about 6 o'clock on the following morning. Therefore I possessed myself in patience, and I was still in bed when in the morning he entered my room. "Well," he exclaimed in French, as he sank wearily into a chair. "I've had a swift and weary journey. Sans has been alarmed by the girl. Why, I cannot tell. Did she go to see Despojol?" "No," I replied. "She didn't see him, but went straight home." "You have not ventured near Despojol, I hope?" "No, I have hardly ventured into the town." "Good. Well, we shall make a double arrest," he went on. When the train arrived at the junction at Montlucan at midnight, Sans, evidently fearing lest he was followed, slipped out of the train and into another on the opposite side of the platform. It is a favorite dodge of elusive persons of his type. So, unseen by him, I also joined the train, and we traveled across to Lyons. There he went to a house in the Rue Chevreul, close to the river, and when I had him safely there I went to the Bureau of Police and asked that observation should be kept upon him until such time that we in Spain should demand his arrest and extradition. The Lyons police know me very well, so 2 agents were at once detailed for that duty, and I immediately made my way back here. It seems that Sans is also wanted in France for a motorcar exploit outside Orleans. Therefore our discovery is indeed a lucky one. Will Sans be arrested?" I asked. "Yes. I have already reported by telegram to Sihor Andrade in Madrid. He will at once ask them in Paris to order the arrest." "And Despojol?" "We have now to await his journey to Nîmes to keep this mysterious appointment with your friend." "Not my friend," I remarked, "rather with my bitterest enemy." Chapter the 21st. At the Hotel Luxembourg. As a detective, Rivero was of outstanding shrewdness. He knew that more could be gained by patience than by sharp activity. Hence he did not go near the Rue de Lalande. Indeed, on the Saturday night we both left Montauban together, and traveled by that slow, cross-country route through the Aveyron, by Vic of Séverac, down to the ancient city of Nîmes, that quaint, quiet old place which contains more monuments of antiquity than any other town in France. Early in the morning we alighted at the station, high upon a viaduct, after a sleepless night, and drove to a small commercial hotel, the Cheval Blanc, in the Place des Arènes, nearly opposite the Luxembourg where the mystery man of Europe had appointed to meet the infamous Despojol. When I inquired for a telegram one was handed to me. It was from Hambledon, saying that de Gex had left for Nîmes and Suzier was returning to Paris, therefore he would follow the latter. Having installed ourselves in the hotel, Rivero went to the concierge, and taking him into his confidence over a 20-franc note, told him that he was very anxious to know whether a gentleman named Rabel had arrived at the Luxembourg. Would he ask the concierge there privately on the telephone? The man in uniform at once rang up the Luxembourg, and addressing the concierge as his dear Henri, made the inquiry. The reply was that Monsieur Rabel was expected at noon. "Ask if a gentleman is expected who has engaged a private sitting room," Rivero said. The reply came back that a gentleman, believed to be English, had arrived in the night and now occupied the best suite. His name was Monsieur Johnson, of London. I then described de Gex to the concierge, who repeated the description to the other hotel. "Yes, monsieur," he said, coming again to me. "Henri believes it is the same gentleman whom you describe." "Who is he?" asked Rivero, much puzzled. "Wait and you will see," I replied, laughing, for we now seemed to be within an ace of success. Just before midday we watched the arrival of the train from Montauban, and from it there descended the man we expected, the notorious Despojol. Though his features were unmistakable he was made up to look much older, his hair being made grey above the ears. At his side there walked a man whom I instantly recognized, and sight of him, I must confess, caused me to hold my breath. It was the sinister-faced Italian, Dr. Moroni. We drew back, and hastening to a taxi, returned at once to our hotel, from the door of which we could see the entrance to the Luxembourg, where a few moments later we saw both the travelers enter. What further devil's work was now in progress? We watched the hotel in patience, until just before 3 o'clock the trio came forth laughing airily. "Why, look," gasped Rivero. "Despojol is with your great English financier, Sihor de Gex." I smiled triumphantly. "I told you that I had a surprise in store for you," I exclaimed. "But if Despojol is with him it must be with some evil intent." "That is certain. While Sihor de Gex was in Madrid we had orders to afford him police protection," Rivero said. "Possibly he suspected that some attempt might be made upon him. Certainly he has no idea of that man's true identity." "Yes, he has, for he has come here specially to meet him in secret. But why that Italian should be here I can only surmise. He is a doctor from Florence, named Moroni, a man of very evil repute." "But why should Sihor de Gex meet such people in secret?" asked Rivero, much astonished. "I'll suppose there is some strong motive why they should meet, the more so, now that I have proved to you that the notorious Despojol is a hireling of this wealthy man de Gex." "A hireling," he gasped. "What do you mean?" "I mean that de Gex hired Despojol to make that attempt upon my life, and I have a suspicion, one not yet entirely verified, that Moroni prepared that deadly orosin by the agency of which it was hoped that I should meet with my death." "Do you really suggest that de Gex, one of the best known and most philanthropic men in Europe, actually hired Despojol to go to your room that night?" my companion asked, his eyes following the trio as they walked together and chatted beneath the trees of the Avenue Fouqueries. "I'll do. And further, de Gex has every motive in closing my lips." "Ah. Then you hold some secret of his, perhaps?" asked Rivero, a new interest being instantly aroused. "I do, one that I intend to expose when I obtain sufficient corroborative evidence," I answered with determination. "But is not the fact of the Tluii men meeting here in secret under assumed names sufficient proof to you that some fresh plot is afoot?" "Certainly it is," Rivero agreed. "But I wish you would reveal to me the whole facts." "It is unnecessary," was my reply. "You are here only to deal with Despojol. I promised I would bring you to him and I have done so. Instead of living in obscurity in a high-up frontier village in the Pyrenees, as you in Madrid believed, I have shown you that he lives in Montauban, where he passes as an industrious commercial traveler. If you searched that house in the Rue de Lalande you might find a quantity of stolen property. As a matter of fact, it has already been searched by the police of Montauban at my request," he replied. "The raid was made last night after Charles Rabel had left. I received a telegram from the commissary of police only an hour ago to the effect that 6 heavy cases of travelers' samples had been opened, and in them was found a great quantity of stolen jewelry, negotiable securities, and other objects of value, including 2 valuable paintings which were missing from the Prado Museum 3 years ago. Then my information has been of some little use to you, eh?" "Of enormous use, Sihor Garfield. You will no doubt receive an official letter of thanks from the Ministry of the Interior," he replied. "But we must act very warily. Despojol will not risk remaining here for long. Besides, some friend may telegraph to him that the police have been to the Rue de Lalande." Once more it was upon the tip of my tongue to explain the manner in which I had become implicated in the evil deeds of Oswald de Gex and his sycophants, when of a sudden he added, "You must really forgive me, Sihor Garfield, but you are an entire mystery to me. You have never been frank with me, never once." "I have been as frank as I dared," I replied. "I tell you that I am here to watch and to strive to elucidate a great plot, one which concerns myself and the woman I love. We have both been victims of a vile and desperate conspiracy." "And whom do you suspect?" "Oswald de Gex." "With what motive?" he asked, for he held the enormously wealthy financial friend of Spain in awe and admiration. "That, alas, is an enigma to me. I only know that he has made an attempt upon my life, and that at least one woman has been sent to the grave by foul means. Do you really infer that Senhor de Gex is an assassin? He asked incredulously. I only tell you what I know, Senor Rivero, I replied quietly. I said that I would lead you to the secret abode of Despojal, and I think I have now fulfilled my promise, and shown you that he is on friendly terms with a great financier whom you in Spain all hold in such high esteem. There is certainly no man more welcome in Madrid than Senhor de Gex, replied the police official. At the Ritz, whether in his own name or incognito, he constantly receives our greatest politicians and most prominent personages. Even the king has more than once commanded him to the palace, in order to confer with him upon acute financial problems in the interests of our country. And yet you infer that Senhor de Gex is an assassin. I'll not only infer it, I said, but I openly allege it. I added hotly, as I thought of Gabrielle. Rivero, glancing at me, quickly raised his shoulders with a gesture of disbelief. Very well, I said. At least I have proved to you that he is a secret friend of the notorious Despojal. Why is he here in Nîmes to consult with de Gex and his friend the Italian, Moroni, if not for purposes of evil? Despojal has made desperate war upon society, and it is de Gex who secretly finances him. Hence he is the servant of the man with money. The dark-faced Spaniard reflected. Well, he exclaimed at last. What you have revealed is certainly most interesting. And if you wish to capture Despojal you must lose no time, I assured him. Remember, he and his gang have agents everywhere with eyes and ears open. He will soon know of the raid upon his retreat in Montauban. No doubt he will, agreed my companion. They will return presently, and then we will arrest him. In the meantime I will call upon the commissary of police. Come with me. We at once took a cab to the prefecture, where we were ushered into the presence of Monsieur Colagna, a rather tall, grey-haired elegant man, with a rosette of the Legion of Honor in his coat. When Rivero introduced himself, the commissary bowed to us both and bade us be seated. In a few quick sentences the Spanish detective explained the object of his mission, and producing his authority from the Spanish ministry, requested the arrest of the infamous bandit Despojal. But is Despojal actually in Nîmes? Cried the commissary, astounded. He certainly is. I identified him on his arrival here at midday. We have been searching for him for over 2 years. He is wanted, among other things, for the murder of Madame Lescaut, a wealthy widow of Aix-en-Provence. Ah! Then it is not a matter for extradition, remarked Rivero. We want him for a dozen crimes of violence in Spain. He attempted the death of my English companion here, Monsieur Garfield, who will give evidence against the commissary. Pressed an electric button, whereupon his secretary appeared. In a few rapid sentences the tall, elegant French official gave orders, and the secretary retired at once to execute them. Despojal is a desperate character. He is always armed, and possesses abnormal strength. He could strangle his strongest opponent, Rivero remarked. I have taken precautions, replied Monsieur Colagna, smiling. I have ordered 10 men in plain clothes to go at once unobtrusively to the Hotel du Luxembourg, and arrest him when he returns. That will frighten de Gex and Moroni, I said quickly. And if they are frightened they will escape. Rivero laughed. I knew that he entirely disbelieved my statement. In his eyes the wealthy friend of Spain could do no. Did not his king invite him to conference, in ignorance, of course, of his true character? I was not surprised at Rivero's attitude, yet I had hoped that Despojal's arrest would be effected without the knowledge of de Gex and his sinister medical friend. I pointed this out, whereupon Rivero remarked with sarcasm, if what you allege against Senhor de Gex and his friend be true, they ought also to be arrested. Yes. They ought, and they will be when I am able to bring forward sufficient evidence to convict them, I replied warmly. Why, I ask you, should Oswald de Gex be in secret association with that dangerous bandit? The Spaniard merely shrugged his shoulders, while at the commissary's request a dossier was brought in, and then they both went through a long catalogue of crimes alleged to have been instigated or actually committed by the man whom I had found in my bedroom, and who had so cleverly deceived me. The list was a formidable one, and showed how elusive was the man whom the police of Europe had been hunting for so long. Among the big batch of papers was a report in English from the Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard stating that the individual in question had arrived in London on a certain date, and stayed with a respectable family at Ham, near Richmond, representing himself to be a lawyer from Barcelona. Thence he had gone to Glasgow, where he stayed at a certain hotel, and then moved to Oban. Afterwards he had come south again to Luton, in Bedfordshire, where all trace of him had been lost. Well, laughed Rivero triumphantly, we shall take good care not to lose him now. No, said the commissary of police. My men will be armed, and will take him, alive or dead. And de Gex and Moroni will then instantly flee. I said, full of regret that I had taken that step which might so easily result in destroying all my chances of solving that puzzling enigma of Gabrielle Tennyson. Nevertheless, it was a source of satisfaction that at last Despujol had, by my watchfulness, been run to earth. Suddenly the telephone at Monsieur Calagna's elbow rang, and after listening, he exclaimed, the men are already posted round the hotel. So all we have to do is to await his return.